Should lower that down a bit. Hello, those of you already here. Just put my drink down. Got a couple of drinks with me. Right. So, put that there. Just moving things into reach. Thank you for those of you joining me over here today. It is 7:30 now, and wearing Snoopy again. 7:30. I was asked yesterday, I think it was yesterday, about talking about autism, maybe reading a bit from my book. Look into my eyes, from one of my books at least. So I'm going to do that, and then kind of lead off of that into whatever discussions we end up having over at the side. Maybe I'll be able to talk while I do this as well. For anyone who finds this interesting or helpful, feel free to give it a thumbs up. And if you're not subscribed and you find it interesting and want to see more from me, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I mainly post about sleep meditations, and but in live streams, I've talked often about doing this kind of live stream, but it's been trying to find a time, because ordinarily this time right now, I would have just walked home from meeting my wife at her work. Probably we'd be having dinner, and so I wouldn't normally be doing this. So that has been kind of the sticking point with doing some kind of a non-sleep meditation live stream, that is trying to find a time when the widest number of people are available to watch it, to make it worthwhile. So anyway, thank you for joining me here, people who are here. I'm going to read a bit from my book today. I'm just flicking through to it. No, that's too far. Flicking through to where I'll read. That's where I'll read. Yeah, so anyone who has joined my channel over recent months, but you don't, perhaps as someone who doesn't really go and click back on other stuff, to see what else is on a channel. If you go back onto my channel, look at things like the playlists, you'll find playlists for autism videos, hypnosis, educational videos, there's sleep meditations for children as well as the ones for adults. There's other meditations, other self-hypnosis, videos, I think 70 or something videos talking about autism and my experiences of being autistic. So yeah, so there's a lot on my channel. In fact, out of the nearly 700 videos that are live on my channel, I think only about 180 of them are sleep meditations, and most of those, God, there's more excitement for Ellen joining the live stream than there is for me. Yeah, so there's only most of my sleep meditations actually have come from since September to now, where I've focused my channel on sleep meditations rather than autism and mental health, which is what my channel was focused on between 2007 and September last year. So all that time, I just occasionally posted sleep meditations, apart from 40 for my 40th birthday, which was a bit of a killer really to do. That was very hard to do. But other than that, my channel has largely been focused on autism and mental health. And every year, pretty much, I've done something on my channel for Autism Awareness Week, sometimes the whole of Autism Awareness Month. But in the UK, they don't really focus on Autism Awareness Month. They focus more just on the week and then Autism Awareness Day, and everything gets condensed down really into that 1 week. So hello to those of you joining in over here. So yeah, so I don't know how many of you have seen that I've scheduled the whole week's worth of um, autism live streams so that you can see what's coming up and what kind of topics I'm going to be talking about. Um, and it was from the ideas, obviously, in the live chat about why don't I read a bit of my book and then use that as a way of starting some discussion, perhaps. So I thought, right, today let's read a bit about my primary years. Then tomorrow, read a bit about my teenage years. Then the day after, read a bit about. I'm trying to remember the order of these things. A bit about the event that transformed my life. And then the day after that, read a bit maybe about loss from my Death, Dying and Loss book. What I was thinking was I might read a bit about loss, and then in the conclusion part of this book, I talk about the impairment of need, blah, 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 if I can talk. I talk about the triad of impairments, and so I thought I could also include some of that, what I've written there about that. And then on the last day of the week, so on Monday, obviously, I'll be doing the Sleep Story live stream thing like normal, sort of 10 p.m. Monday night. So Sunday, Abby has said she'll join me on here, and she will read some of the chapter that she wrote for this book about what it's like to be with someone who's autistic, and then obviously we can take some questions on that as well and answer stuff for you guys. I'm having some of my coffee because once I start talking, I will probably forget about it. And then it'll be a very cold coffee. There's nothing wrong with a cold coffee, but it's better when it's a little bit warmer. So I'm going to read a bit of chapter 3. See if I can get it in focus. About the primary years. I don't know how much, this hasn't been incredibly planned out because all of these are trying to squeeze them around everything else that I'm trying to do or have to do, and having time to rest as well. So I haven't planned out the exact amount that I'm going to read, but I thought I'd start reading some and then stop at some point. What, you mean you won't listen until Sunday? You're going to now shut your ears off, wait until Sunday, and then join in on Sunday when Abby's here? Oh, my computer's trying to do an update. That's not happening now. So, no, Abby and myself can both be in the same room on Sunday, so that we can both easily answer questions. You know how much I can type in my answers. The last thing you want is me typing in the live chat. So, I'm just going to read this as it's written. And I don't normally read, as in I don't normally read to camera or anything. So, I do have a second chair. Abby put it next to me the other day when she came on here. So it will depend how easily we fit on camera. I can always move the laptop further away as well to fit the two of us in if needed. So, many of my earliest memories are from my primary years. So I'll just give a bit of context. Obviously, the entire beginning of this book was about under primary age. So more about what I've learned from my mum and my dad, but what I learned from my dad after he died. So that's stuff that he had written down about me that I didn't know until he died. And then I grabbed a whole bunch of records and stuff from his flat after he died, just thinking it might be interesting for family history. And that's what the first part of my book is based on. So this is kind of based on where I first really remember. I'm not really someone who remembers that far back into the past. So many of my earliest memories are from my primary years. I don't really remember much before that, and what I think I remember, I can't be confident about. Are they my memories, or just memories based on photographs I've seen? In this chapter, I'll share my experiences of primary school years from about 5 years old to 10 years old. During this time, I began to recognize that I was different and started to learn about how to cope with the world around me. Mum always described me as having a lot of common sense. I'd describe myself as having common sense that sometimes isn't common and other times doesn't make sense. From a very young age, Mum trusted me to look after my younger siblings. She tried babysitters, but often I was still the person with the most common sense in the room. I had good observation skills for safety, and because I couldn't care less about most things that others seemed to really care about, I was often very calm. If there was an incident that needed to be handled, I was likely to be the one who could work out what to do and then calmly do it. This trait's helped me immensely throughout my life. Mum was a riding instructor, so growing up, she had to work when everyone else was off. My stepdad was a landscape gardener, so he worked long hours whenever the weather was suitable. Because my mum taught people to ride horses, I spent most of my time around horses as a child. From the age of about 8, when Mum was teaching, I'd often be looking after my brothers. We'd be at the riding centre, so Mum wasn't far away if we needed her. She couldn't afford to have anyone else look after us, but she trusted me and felt I was responsible enough to look after my brothers. I knew that if there was a problem, I could either find Mum or seek out other adults who ran the stables. I remember some of my first experiences attending my first primary school. It was a small school with a cold outdoor swimming pool. I've certain memories that stand out about the pool. I remember flies floating in the pool. I remember the smell of the water. It smelt like water. What I mean is, it didn't have an odd smell, but I remember the fresh, watery smell from the pool. I also remember the feeling of being in the water, and remember times when my nan would come along and help out during swimming lessons. I didn't like the swimming cap I had to wear. It used to hurt my head when I put it on and took it off. The cap would stick to my hair and felt like it pulled hair out of my head whenever I took it off. But I did enjoy swimming. My favourite thing about swimming was being underwater. I loved putting my head underwater. And as I got more confident, I'd hold myself fully underwater at the steps. I loved how the sound changed underwater. It was quiet and peaceful, not as chaotic and overwhelming as the world above the water. I remember believing I could almost breathe underwater. I remember believing just read that. Um, I was aware that I couldn't, but I felt that I was able to stay underwater longer by relaxing and imagining I was breathing. So I'd make all the actions of breathing without actually breathing in. I'd almost cycle air around, as if I was somehow breathing within myself. I didn't really have many friends in primary school. I was polite, and so if someone engaged with me, I'd be polite and do my best to try to engage with them back. But I didn't really have much interest in interacting with other people. I'd much rather have spent a break time at the hedges around the outside of the school grounds, searching for snails and looking at other creatures. I didn't feel like I was missing anything. I would take an ice cream tub around with me, which I'd fill with leaves, twigs, snails, caterpillars, grasshoppers. I wasn't necessarily very good at socializing and didn't particularly care about others. That isn't to say I wanted bad things to happen to others. I've always wanted everyone to be all right, but I was far more caring of animals. One day, when I was out with my mum while she was teaching horse riding, I found an injured grasshopper. I took it home and tried to nurse it back to health by creating an environment for it and giving it some food. Unfortunately, it didn't survive. I didn't get upset about it not surviving. I wanted it to live and get better, but my attitude was once it had died, it had died. I did all I could do. I did all I could think of to try and save it. And to my knowledge, I couldn't have done any more. I remember burying it in the garden because I thought that's what you're supposed to do with dead things. Then I got on with my life. I didn't get upset about not being able to save it because I'd done everything I felt I was able to do. At one time, Mum tried to arrange a birthday party for me at home. She invited many children I knew, and on the day of my party, no one turned up. I think this was a telling sign of my relationship with others. I was polite to people, but never really invested in my relationships with other children in school. I was pretty much the same at home. I'd prefer to spend time alone, doing my own thing, but was generally polite. I don't recall too much play with my brothers. When we did play, it was usually something active like hide and seek or manhunt, or it was making dens or climbing trees. It wasn't really things where I was having to play with my brothers, but more things where I played alongside my brothers, or could feel like I was doing my own thing or engaging in a project, making something for some purpose. I was far better able to get on with adults. I'd ask questions all the time about things I was interested in, wanting to know more. At school, I'd take my time getting ready to leave lessons so that the other children would leave, and I could then ask the teacher any questions I had. If the lesson didn't interest me, then I'd get out as quickly as I could and try to avoid being stuck in the middle of the crowd of children all leaving at once. If I had to choose between spending time with children or adults, I would usually choose to stand around the adults and would normally latch on to one adult who I'd sit next to and talk to. That adult was normally chosen because they'd first approached me and started talking to me, but they'd then be stuck with me until they walked away. If they walked off and left me, I wouldn't seek out anyone else out. I'd rather sit on my own and keep myself to myself. Sometimes another adult would come and talk to me, and I'd then talk to them about topics I enjoyed until they walked off too. Before I really discovered non-fiction books, my favourite thing to play with was Lego. I'd like to make what was on the box. Most of the Lego I had was normal Lego, but I always asked for Technic Lego for birthdays and Christmas. It looked and sounded more grown up, and my view was, with Technic Lego, you were making something proper, not just a brick house or an equally simple item. I remember getting a Lego train set one year. I loved the feel of the train rails, how smooth they were on top. I loved how they fitted together and the smell of the pieces. I loved the feel and the smell of Lego tyres. I'd put them in my mouth and gently squish them between my teeth just to get the feeling of them. When I used my Lego, I'd place parts in orderly piles on the floor and would get annoyed if anyone knocked them over or messed them up. I've mentioned previously, probably not right here, and will probably mention again, that things I say seem to have a lot of contradiction in them, which is confusing to me. However, I see these areas of contradiction and confusion as places where I'm likely to learn more about myself. One such area is how I like things to be tidy and to make sense, yet I can easily live in a mess. My Lego on the floor probably looked messy, but I'd have everything in its place. I'd know where all the different kinds of blocks were. There'd be order to my mess. As a child, especially, I found that I could focus on one thing, and that what mattered to others didn't necessarily matter to me. Mum often said she thought I would grow up to be a mad professor, always coming up with ideas and creating inventions, but living in a mess. I don't remember thinking of my bedroom as a mess. Things would be in piles where I could find them. I did sometimes play team games, but I never volunteered to play. Rather, it be because I was told I had to play. Just like in school, when children are told they have to play football. I'm not totally against playing team games. I just don't focus on the team element of the games. I remember in my second primary school, a very small school in Arundel, playing football from time to time with other children because many of them enjoyed football, and the only way to fit in was to join in. I've always liked being very active, so I liked running around. I liked being chased by people and seeing if I could evade them, but I didn't like having to be part of a team and having to interact with others. What's more, I didn't care whether I won or lost, which didn't seem to go down well with others on the same team as me. My focus was on questions like, I wonder whether I can make it to the other end of the pitch without anyone getting the ball off me. I didn't care whether they could or not. I would just want to find out the answer, and then the next time I would try to do better than my previous time. I remember one football game, where my thinking got me in trouble. One advantage of not particularly being interested in others and treating everyone about the same, regardless of who they are and what they're like, is that I'd blend into the background and fit into most groups. There've always been exceptions, but generally, I could loiter with a group and no one would question my presence. Sometimes people wouldn't even be aware that I was there. One day, while playing football on the playground in primary school, the ball was kicked by someone. It left the playground, rolled down the grass bank alongside the playground. Down the bank, two children got hold of the ball and started to throw it between them. Another child and I went down the bank to get it. When we got near the children, the other boy went closer to get the ball. He got between them and they started throwing the ball over his head to each other. I got close to them, but was stood off to the side, almost like myself and the two children were in a triangle. One of the children said, "Here," and threw the ball to me. I caught the ball, turned around, and started walking back to the playground. At that point, it didn't cross my mind that they were including me in their game of throwing the ball over the head of the other child, and that they didn't actually want us to have the ball back. I just thought it was thrown to me to take back to the playground. I walked towards the playground and back up the grass bank when one of the children jumped on me angrily. I had no idea why they were angry and why they jumped on me. Then one of the children playing football shouted at that child and jumped on him. Then another child jumped on that child, and another child who was playing football jumped on them. And then it seemed nearly all the boys in the playground got involved. I calmly crawled out from under the pile of children, walked across the playground still holding the ball, and told the teacher that a fight seemed to have started down the grass bank. I didn't think any more of it. Some teachers dealt with the situation and the break time ended. The next morning in assembly, the head teacher spoke about the fight that happened in the playground the day before. He said he wanted the children who started it to stand up. About 6 children stood up. He then said the person who was the main cause of the fight hadn't stood up, and he wanted him to stand up as well. I looked around, wondering who it was. As far as I could see, the children that had taken the ball had both stood up, as had the children that attacked those two when one of them had jumped on me. After what seemed like a long pause, the head singled me out and told me to stand up, saying I was the cause of the fight. This confused me. All I'd done was go and get the ball and walk back up onto the playground with the ball. And then, when a fight broke out, I'd gone and got a teacher to deal with the fight. I remember being annoyed for ages about being blamed for something I felt I hadn't done. I will stop there for a minute because I haven't actually seen anything up here. Yes, coffee. So, yeah, I can carry on reading bits, but I will stop for a bit, see what people have said here. I'll try and scroll down as quick as I can. Da, da, da. Oh, another riding instructor. That's always good to see. Yeah, this buffering thing I think is starting to get probably annoying. I don't know if my coffee is still warm. I will just have some. Let me have some coffee. Yeah, so obviously that's just a tiny bit. I can, if people want me to, carry on reading a bit more. No one will want to buy my book then. They'll hear me read the whole thing. But I can carry on reading a bit more, kind of what comes next. But yeah, so obviously there are things like not caring, not realizing that you've been in the middle. It's a bit like that thing where people say, how accidents seem to happen around them without realizing that they're actually the cause of the accidents. Issues would happen, like fights would break out, and like this example, I personally, even today, I don't think of myself as the cause of the fight because I literally did exactly what I set out to do. I think someone attacking me as probably the cause of the fight. But obviously, the teachers did think that I was the cause. A little bit like I said, I think yesterday about the lad who stabbed the art teacher with the craft knife. Um, it would be kind of like, well, that happened because of the teacher's actions, but the lad is the one that obviously gets the blame for it. Um, Obviously, the difference is that I didn't do any harm to anyone, but it's that kind of thing. Sometimes you get the blame for something that really wasn't entirely your fault. Yeah, I don't want to send everyone to sleep with my reading, but I am trying to read normally, not drifting and floating asleep reading. I'll tell you if the coffee's warm in a minute. Room temperature, probably. So not cold yet. Yeah, I think by taking, obviously, I'm sure I'll probably mention it, but by taking things quite literally, you end up not noticing necessarily times that you're being bullied versus times that someone's joking with you. Um, and so, really, you just want everyone around you to be serious. As you get older, obviously, you start understanding humor better. But okay, I won't count from 20 to 19, 18, 17. I won't do any of that. 16, 15. I'll do none of that. So yeah, so as long as you get older and you learn a bit more about nuances of things like humor, you still don't necessarily always get it. But when you know the context is humor, so for example, if I watch a stage, you know, sort of a comedian on stage or something, you kind of know that they must be doing humor because that's what they're on stage for. And so that's okay. But when it's like, I think everyone has one of those relatives or friends who you never quite know whether they were being sarcastic or whether they're being honest, or you can't tell with that they spend so much time being sarcastic. You can't tell when they're being sarcastic or telling the truth. um, and that I really really struggle with that. And obviously I think humor is a difficult thing for a lot of people anyway, to some extent. Yeah, something that's in Abby's bit that she'll read on her day. She may not read that exact bit because or else she'll be reading for ages. But something that's in the bit about being with me is the fact that if I start saying something, I pretty much won't stop saying it, even if you say that even if you zoned out, and even if you say that you're not interested, because I've started telling you, I carry on until I've finished saying what I'm going to say. Um, so it's not just like I have to finish a puzzle or whatever. um, I end up having to finish what I'm going to say, whether you like it or not. um, but then there are uh, some kind of um, there are times when something happens that makes me say, no, I've had enough of this now, I'm going. So for example, I've said before about computer games, if I play a computer game and it reaches a point where I keep having to restart bits, then as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to play anymore. I'm not playing because of an interest to try and win the game or complete the game. I'm playing because I want to just play the game. Um, so with things like computer games, I don't see them in the same way as a puzzle, where if you've done a puzzle, you want to get all the pieces in place for the puzzle. If you're doing Lego, you want to say you're making a piece of Technic Lego. I've not made that yet. I've got that from Christmas to still make. If you're making a piece of Technic Lego, then you end up feeling that compulsion to complete, say, that Technic Lego. But if you're playing, say, a computer game, I think because computer games nowadays are so big and so expansive, you end up finding that really what you're doing, or I find that what I'm doing, is more a case of playing because yeah, I always play on easy for the same reason. Playing because, for example, I like The Last of Us, and I'm looking forward to The Last of Us 2. I've watched people play through The Last of Us again to kind of recapture the whole storyline and everything. And but if The Last of Us 2 ends up being too difficult for me, I'm not going to keep trying and trying and trying and find myself keep getting stuck at the same place over and over again. I'm going to just think, right, I'll watch someone else's playthrough. And if that person, say on YouTube, keeps getting stuck at the same place over and over again, then I will, if they don't cut it edit themselves, I will just fast forward until they're unstuck from that bit and just watch their playthrough so that I can watch the whole story. And I'll normally do that with a handful of different players, say on YouTube, so that if there are things, because there's always like secret bits that open up bits of dialogue that if you'd gone and discovered that, then like for example in The Last of Us, Daniel, you may know this, in The Last of Us near the dam, if you take a certain route, you find a teddy bear, and that teddy bear is on a grave. And so if you happen to stumble on that, it then opens up a bit of dialogue about forgetting to put the sort of transformery figure on the grave of the character who had died not long earlier in the game, in playing time. So they died earlier in the game, not in playing time, but in playing time, they'd not died that long earlier. But that's a bit that you would only know if you stumbled upon that specific bit. So bits like that, that's why I'd perhaps watch someone else play through multiple times. But yeah, but I always play games on the easiest setting because I'm more interested in working through, say, the storyline. So I'm rubbish at multiplayer online games, things like that. I much prefer a story driven game that I can follow and go through, or a game, for example, I quite like, as I've mentioned before, the recent. I like all the Assassin's Creed games, but I like the recent two quite a lot because of the fact you literally can just rock up to someone who says, "Would you mind helping me? I've got something I need doing," and then you go and do some help, and and so you feel like, I don't know. For me, it's like I'm just living in this world and running through this world, rather than it being rather than feeling like it's a game. So the game is almost incidental. I've kind of lost interest to a certain extent in the actual story of the Assassin's Creed stuff since they ditched all of or significantly cut right back on all the future bits, because it kind of took away the sort of what all the early games had of, here's the storyline that you're following for the game. They took all that away because people complained about not liking the future stuff. But to me, the future stuff was the game, was the storyline to the game. The past stuff was figuring out the future stuff. And now they ditched a lot of the future stuff. It feels like it's just a game set in the past largely. And so I end up just kind of sticking. I quite like the open world, just roam around, do some missions, not have it too difficult. Nothing is a struggle. And the same with The Witcher. I like The Witcher as well for the same reason. But it's something where you feel like you're a part of a world. I can relate. I don't know. It sounds weird, but it's almost like I can be human in a computer game like that, as long as there's no humans in that computer game. So if I play, for example, Elder Scrolls Online, where there's perhaps real people, that's rubbish. But if I play one of the Elder Scrolls games where I'm interacting with non-playable characters, that's different. I can engage with them, and the conversations are structured, and everything has that structure that makes me feel like I'm a part of this world. So that probably sounds odd to people, but that's me. There does seem to be a lot of autistic people that like trains. And who wouldn't like Thomas the Tank Engine? Yeah, I agree. When people won't listen to me, I never, obviously, give it much thought about the sorry for them, but I do think they're the ones missing out. And yes, I play Minecraft a lot. I've put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours into Minecraft. I've got some of my videos on my YouTube channel, Minecraft meditations, as well as me showing off things like my pyramids and stuff like that. Um, yeah, but I definitely, just like you've just mentioned, Austin, about the I just like the free build mode. I would like a mix, personally, a mix of Minecraft and non-playable characters who are kind of more interactive. I would love to be able to turn up at a Minecraft village that's obviously randomly generated or whatever. Turn up a Minecraft village and have those villagers set tasks for me and say, "Oh, would you mind going and doing this? It would be quite nice if you would do that," but all in like the free build mode. Um, Something like that, I'd quite like. Something that makes it feel like um, there's, I don't know, a world that Minecraft is. I quite like. So if that ever gets done, it might be done somewhere, but I just play it on PlayStation 4 or on my PlayStation Vita. Um, Probably one of the few people who still plays a PlayStation Vita. But yeah, but I would love it if you could turn up and literally have the villagers like, say, Witcher 3 type NPCs, that you interact with them and you go on missions for them, and sometimes they join you on a mission for a bit to do something. But yeah, with puzzle games, I don't know. I think it's very difficult to get the balance right. If I have if I find it hard work in the slightest, I just think no, I've uh, failed twice or I've not been succeeding for X amount of time. I give up. Um, but if it's easy enough so that I can keep going through it, for example, I remember as a young child, I don't know if I wrote about it in my book, but I remember as a young child when I got an original Game Boy, um, obviously playing Tetris for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, because when it's going ultra fast, you don't notice that it's going ultra fast if you've been sort of playing from level naught onwards, because it gradually gets harder as you go. And especially when you're young, I think you just get used to it. So games like that, I would obsess about wanting to keep completing each level and getting up to the next level. And likewise, if there's like a Sudoku or something where complete these levels and then you move on to the next one, I end up thinking, oh, I'm 5 away. Let's keep going. Right, I've achieved that. Let's see if I can get to the next one. So yes, I'll have some coffee and then I will read just a little bit more um, of this. But yeah, I think NPCs in computer games, so non-playable characters in computer games, are preferable to real people in computer games, because real people are chaotic, and even though you would think, oh, real people, that means that this part I'm talking about wanting to go and interact in these, with these different people, um, you'd think that'd be fine. But the fact is, you don't have easy kind of that response is because of this behavior and all that stuff. Whereas an NPC is like a dialed back human being. They're a bit more predictable. Some are too shallow in some games, but some get the balance just right. And I think things like The Witcher 3 did that quite well, of getting that balance right, that you felt like you were having a dialogue with somebody and like almost like it wasn't leading the storyline in a certain direction as such. Whereas I feel that it's a bit too rigid in Skyrim. But yeah, I will read a bit more of this. And just reading the last few comments here. I think in relation to what age in childhood autism impacted me the most, partly is dependent on what was going on in which parts of my childhood. The largest duration of impact was definitely secondary school years. Um, Primary school, you kind of can disappear off in a bush and no one pays attention to you. Whereas secondary school years, you're kind of expected to follow certain, do certain things and be in certain places. So, yeah, and being old, obviously, any online shooting game like Call of Duty, obviously, as soon as I spawn somewhere, I hear some probably 12-year-old shoot me and kill me and swear about how brilliant they are at the time they did it. And then I respawn again, and the same thing happens over and over again. Um, I'm obviously too old to be able to figure out how to make sure that as soon as I appear, I don't get killed. Um, I would probably say that apart from Abby, I don't really recall any friend that I would say I've had more of a connection with. Um, my best friend I see once a year-ish. So it's you know, people in your life, in my experience, are just people there by default. I rarely make a sort of effort to go out of my way to make and maintain friendships. Where's my walker? Yeah. So yeah, I don't see people particularly often. Yeah, that's what I just questioned. What walker? Oh, you're cracking a joke. I hadn't noticed. um, yes, I'm probably not old enough for a frame yet. I do get told off for keep on uh, implying that I'm old. So let me read a bit more, and then I'll read the comments and engage a bit more as well. Um, so every year as a young child, our family went on holiday to local holiday camps. One year, while on holiday at a local camp, my brother and I were signed up to learn and play football with West Ham football players. So no comments there from people. Um, my brother appeared to love it and played well. I, on the other hand, didn't. I didn't want to play football. I didn't care that it was apparently professional football players teaching us, despite being told that I should care and that this was a great opportunity. My stepdad got very angry about me refusing to play football and join in the football lessons he paid for. He was saying how he had paid for us to do it and we should be grateful and keen to do it. It is what boys do and what boys like. My view was that I didn't ask him to pay for me. I didn't ask to play football. I didn't say I wanted to play football. So why would I play football? It wasn't my problem. He'd spent his money on it. To me, that didn't change anything. Telling me he spent money on it, that I should take part, wasn't going to change anything. I still wasn't going to play. What I wanted to do on holiday was to go to the beach and to play on my own, or to go swimming in the pool on my own. I used to dislike having to spend enforced time with my brothers and family. So the last thing I'd want to do was to spend enforced time in the company of football players and a group of other highly active and chaotic children. I've always preferred peace and calm over chaos and sensory overload. The first primary school I attended was in Aldingbourne. I was there until I was 7. The family then moved from Westergate to Warningcamp, a small town a few miles away on the outskirts of Arundel. There I went to a primary school in Arundel before attending secondary school in Littlehampton. While I was at primary school in Aldingbourne, I began reading books. I remember lessons where teachers would read stories like The BFG and Stig of the Dump, and we would sit on the floor and listen to the stories being read. I used to listen to these stories being read and think that they didn't sound like stories we had available to us to read. I didn't really understand why I had to read these books. I read them, but they didn't really interest me. They were so small and easy to read that by the time I left the primary school, I'd read every single book available to me. My reading age had been measured at the end of my final term in school when I was 7. I was identified as having a reading age of at least 9.5. I really, I didn't really enjoy reading the fiction books I was made to read. My favourite fiction books were those where each chapter ends with different options and you have to pick out an outcome for the chapter and read from the page number for the chosen outcome. For books like that, I used to like trying to work out which option was likely to have the most beneficial outcome and why. The books were always mystery books, so I used to try to look through the chapters to notice any clues, either in the writing or in the images, that would give me more knowledge about which option I should select. I don't recall seeing any non fiction books until I was 8 years old. Prior to that age, the only books I was aware of were very thin and uninteresting children's books. It was shortly after starting my second primary school that I became aware of other books and genres. Not long after starting in the school, the head teacher at the time was clearing out old books. I knew my grandparents had old books, but I'd never looked at them. We had some old books at home too, but I hadn't looked at those either. But in school, we were told that we could look through these books and see if there are any that we would like to keep. Obviously, I, like any other child, wasn't going to want to miss out, so I took a look at the books. I still own almost all of the books that I picked up that day. One or two have gone missing over the years, but may turn up one day. The first thing I noticed about the books was the age of some of them. Some dated back to the 1800s, which I found exciting. To be able to hold and read something from that long ago. To me as an 8-year-old, these books, these books that were over 100 years old, were fascinating. They were older than any people I knew. I was able to hold something that people had held and read a century earlier. I still love old books, and for some reason, my definition of an old book is still one that is dated 1899 or earlier, even though I'm, at the time of writing this, 30 years older now than I was as an 8-year-old. I don't think of books from the 1900s as old, even though now a book from 1929 would be as old to me now as a book from 1899 was to me then. The second thing I noticed about all these old books, and it still wasn't the contents of the books, was their smell. I loved the smell. There was and still is something calming about the smell of an old book. Third was the feel. They didn't feel like the school books I was used to handling, with their glossy pages. The feel of things is very important to me. I don't mind the feel of a new glossy book and don't mind the smell of a new glossy book, but nothing compares to the feel or the smell of old books. That day in school, I picked up many books about geography, physics, poetry, and even some novels like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Gulliver's Travels, which I still have on the shelf next to me here. That day in school, just read that. At my second primary school, I had stopped reading fiction books altogether because I couldn't see the point in them when nothing they taught was real. The last fiction book I read, other than Z for Zachariah and Macbeth in secondary school, which obviously I was made to read as part of our English lessons, was a hardback collection of Secret Seven stories, which my mum gave me one day when I was home ill from school, aged 8. At about the same age, I found a book that had a profound influence on me, The Magic of Thinking Big. This was a book I found lying around the house one day. And as a small child who loved magic, seeing a book with big and magic, both written in the title, was enough to make me want to know what it was about. The book taught me that you can achieve almost anything. You just have to plan and put in effort. I learned an incredible amount between the age of 8 and 10. It helped me immensely. The next significant learning wasn't until I was 13, when I discovered hypnosis. As well as discovering the magic of thinking big, I lived in an environment that allowed me to spend a lot of time in the woods, or at least outside with nature. I used to spend much of my time sitting in trees. I found life at home often stressful and noisy, and I wanted to escape. So I'd go into the woods, I'd find a tree, climb up high, and sit on a branch with my eyes closed, just listening. In the tree, I'd focus my attention on the sounds of birds. I'd try to locate where they were by focusing on individual sounds. I'd focus on the sounds of the rustling leaves and try to notice each individual one, trying to break the sound down and see how it was formed. As an 8-year-old, I'd never heard of meditation, but I had discovered meditation for myself. Sitting in a tree doing this helped me to feel calm. It helped to shut out the noise. I think I was lucky having the opportunity to grow up in the countryside rather than in a town during this period of my life. Warning Camp became a place I would call home as a child and still think of as home now. Having a mum who was a riding instructor also gave me the opportunity to be around horses for all of my childhood. Mum has always told me I seem to have a natural talent for horse riding. I think I just feel a closer connection to animals than I do to people. Animals don't expect me to try to communicate with them verbally. They don't communicate with multiple messages like people do. Most animals communicate very simply. People can say one thing and mean something else. And then when you don't understand that they meant something else, they get annoyed or they tell you that you're stupid for not realizing or understanding. On the other hand, an animal will just communicate one message at a time. I used to have no problem getting on to any horse and riding it. Horses seemed to trust me, as I did them. That doesn't mean I thought they would never hurt me, but what I trusted was that they would be clear with their messages and that I would understand them. Most wild animals and many other animals don't demand my attention. I like being in nature, just observing, rather than needing to play with the animals. I love observing and learning, and it was this mindset which helped me to discover meditation sitting in the trees. All I was trying to do was to observe and learn. In the same way that someone parking a car may turn the music down to help them park, I closed my eyes to help me hear and focus. During these early years, I started to become aware of patterns. I don't know whether I had always liked patterns, but I was becoming more self aware and had to become more aware of what I liked and didn't like. I seemed to have an ability to guess well with competitions like how many coins are in the jar. At a country fair, when I was about 8, I guessed the number of coins in a jar and got it correct. During the summer holidays, when I was 9 or 10, myself, along with many other children from the 2 primary schools in Arundel, painted a mural of different animals. On the last day, we were told to guess how many animals were on the mural, and the person who guessed closest would win a prize to be presented by the Mayor of Arundel. I guessed closest, just one number out. Many of my lifelong interests started between the ages of 5 and 10. I've always been confused by people changing tastes and interests as they grow up. My view is that if you like something, why would you one day not like it? Between 5 and 10, I developed an interest in the music of Elvis Presley. I discovered books that taught me things rather than just being stories. I started meditating, although I didn't know it was meditation at the time. I also became aware of some of my habits, which would sometimes get me in trouble. If I heard tunes or sounds, I'd make the same sound myself, usually whistling it. I'd copy words or phrases that people said, which for some reason resonated in my mind when I heard them. What's more, I would often copy them in a replication of the person's voice. I didn't realize that mimicking people could offend them. It would just happen automatically. I didn't even realize I was mimicking them. And when I became aware I was saying or doing something like whistling or saying a phrase in a specific way, I didn't normally know where it came from or why I was saying it. It would just happen. I'd find myself mimicking accents and speech patterns that seemed to resonate with me. The best way to avoid offending people was to avoid people, to try and keep my mouth shut, and to keep what went through my head in my head. This was never easy, as most of what I would do would just happen. Often others would point out to me what I was doing, and I found it very difficult to stop something when I didn't notice myself doing it. Mum had always described me as, I'll stop there for a second and read that bit maybe in a minute. So I can see out the corner of my eye this scrolling along. Let's read. Goosebumps. Never ever read Goosebumps. Let's see. Um, yeah, today I'm reading a bit of my book from my primary school years, and then obviously talking and engaging, using this as kind of a way to talk about stuff to do with autism. And yeah, it's from my autobiography, Look Into My Eyes. Um, I'll have to look up Minecraft Comes Alive. Things I only play Minecraft. Hopefully, with the new consoles coming out, they'll have more PC-like stuff on them. That'd be cool. Yeah, I've still got the a couple of Usborne books where you choose your own kind of. You follow the path where it says, so and so gets presented with two doors, and they have to pick one, and then it will say at the bottom, like, go to page X if you choose that door, go to this page if you choose this door. Um, so I've always liked that sort of thing. Yeah, so as I say, I've never read the Goosebumps books. Don't really know anything about them, but I have seen the first of the films. Um, but if you can find those books, one of them is on my shelf somewhere here, but I don't think it's in reach, or else I'd magically pull it out now. Um, yeah, I quite like games where you select different dialogue options, and I think that's one of the things I like about um, things like the latest Assassin's Creed games, where you can do that. About Witcher, about uh, the Elder Scrolls games as well. That you have some freedom, kind of, over what questions you're going to choose. I think it kind of more with Skyrim defeats the object when you can just ask every single question. Oh, and the other one, the Insomniac game. No, what is it? I can't think of it now. The one with the androids and stuff, on PlayStation, as well. So I quite like it where by asking certain questions, you're shutting down certain other questions, so that you are genuinely have that sense of guiding things forward rather than just instantly. You can just ask every question, and it defeats the object with them saying, "What do you want to ask? What do you want to answer with?" Uh, for me personally, around the likable sociably, I am polite. I um, try to do the right things. Um, so I blend into the background. People normally say that I don't see people so much nowadays, but in school or whatever, people would say he's a very polite child. Um, but I think there's a difference between that and likable. I wasn't unlikable, but it wasn't like people were suddenly drawn to me as such, thinking, "Oh, I want to hang around with Dan." And obviously, I've never been that sort of person. I've never been someone that people actively want to hang around with. Um, I've been someone who people, if they were to describe me, would say that I'm polite and what have you, but would never. They never really think about me after I'm not there. I'm sure some people do, but as a general rule, just scrolling down. I've always wanted to write one of the sort of work out your own path type stories, um, as a computer program almost, so that you can really make it enormous. But that's a lot of hard work. But in my head, I've always liked the idea of that. Animals are the best. Yeah, I used to just jump on any horse. Mum would have to break in horses as part of her job that she would do, and sometimes she sort of say, "Oh, would you want to come along and meet the horse that I'm currently breaking in?" And no one's ridden it yet or anything, and it wouldn't take much for the horse to come to the fence or the gate, and for it to allow me to climb on its back and ride it bareback, just sort of around the field. Um, and it would always surprise mum at how easy horses just seem to instantly trust me. Yeah, one thing that a lot of people have said after reading my book uh, has been that sort of, I don't know, being able to see that, oh, I'm not the only one that thinks like this or has had that kind of experience, or they get a certain sense of familiarity with it. And the reason the magic of thinking big was lying around our home was because mum briefly joined Amway. Uh, and it's one of their books they try and give you to motivate you to think, yeah, I can achieve anything I want. And then you don't make any income. But that's the idea. There is still coffee in my cup. Yeah, I can imagine a cat helping there, um, as can dogs. Did I have to engage in imaginative play? I've never thought about it. It was never something that was ever put upon me to engage with. I think I think I've had a very fortunate set of circumstances that I went from a small primary school, a reasonably small primary school, where I was in a class of maybe 10 or 12 children. And I was very young, obviously, at that primary school. So we didn't do a lot anyway. Most of it was scribbling on your own and being taught very mundane stuff and reading very thin uh, children's books. And then I went to a second primary school where there was 32 children in the entire primary school, and we were in classes, so it was even smaller. And the children in my class misbehaved a lot. They were very violent and aggressive, and so nothing ever got done. So that meant that all of this time period where ordinarily you might be in a position where you face these issues, I never faced. And then growing up in the middle of the countryside instead of in a town or something meant that I didn't have all of the out of school issues that people can have. Um, I could literally go to the woods every single day and sit in a tree, and no one would care. No one would ask where I am, and I could then. I got a water as well. Yeah, so I could sit in a tree. No one would ask where I am, and even at sort of 9, 10 years old, um, people weren't as scared of the world around us as they are now. I could be in the woods, and then literally uh, come in at like 9, 10 o'clock at night, and no one would have thought to come and search for me or to bat an eyelid about the fact I'm not home as a small child. It would just be assumed, oh, Dan's probably up a tree somewhere. Once it gets to bedtime or a time he needs to go to bed, he'll come in. No, playing with toys, I've never done imaginatively. And I don't think of myself, obviously, despite what you all know I do, I don't think of myself at all as imaginative. Um, Even though I'm aware that I must have some level of imagination, but I don't think of myself as that in terms. I just think of myself as, well, it's logical. This step leads to that step. What alternative is there? Um, but yeah, so I've got an entire shelf of old books here, and I've got more old books sort of over there, and old music books and all sorts of things. Um, and it is the texture and what have you. Uh, yeah, fingernails touching it, that's a problem. But yeah, it's textures that I like. So I also have worked in children's homes, so I'm not particularly fussy when it comes to tea and coffee. In children's homes, it could come with salt, spit, or literally anything in it, and you just drink it. Yeah, I like to try and turn pages nice and carefully. Um, but even now, I'll pick up books and I'll sometimes will close my eyes so I can enhance the feeling. Um, yeah, for those of you who it's glitchy for, hopefully the recorded version of this, once it's all finished, won't be glitchy. Um, I would say that if someone has the chance to be diagnosed, if it's felt that it would be helpful, then it is probably better to have a diagnosis and know that you've got it. 'Cause as I've talked before, my trouble was that for ages I thought I could be autistic, but didn't want a label. And then when I needed to know whether I was definitely autistic or not, because it would help if I had a diagnosis if I was, I then had to go through over a year's worth of process of getting a diagnosis for a situation that was taking place there and then. So, had I just gone and got a diagnosis sooner, or had my parents done it? In fact, um, the bit I've missed in here, the bit prior to primary school years, um, my dad had written to social services. My mum and dad had separated. My dad wrote to social services saying, "I think something's wrong with Daniel," and he listed a whole bunch of things he thought were wrong with me. And I read it now as an adult, and and as someone who's worked in autism, in the field of autism, and I read it and I know he's identified that I'm autistic when I was really young. But um, because my mum and dad had divorced, the social worker came around, because they'd divorced. We had social services involved at the time, um, because it wasn't particularly amicable. And the social worker came round. My granddad, who was a very respectable member of society, hopefully this wouldn't happen nowadays. It's not supposed to, but it happened then. He just, in this sort of the early 80s ish or mid 80s, he said, "There's nothing wrong with Daniel. Daniel's perfectly fine. His dad will just be stirring problems. You don't need to see him." And so the social worker's letter, which I found when I took a whole load of dad's stuff after he died, um, pretty much just said, uh, we spoke to Daniel's granddad. He said that this will just be the dad stirring trouble, causing trouble. And so we didn't feel it was necessary. He said, "You don't need to see Daniel." We agreed we probably don't need to see Daniel. So we never saw him. So there was a chance when I was a small child where my dad potentially had instigated me possibly getting an assessment, and my granddad and my mum had stopped that from happening. And the social worker, instead of nowadays where the social worker would say, "Well, yes, it may be the dad just stirring, but we'll see Daniel anyway because we've got a duty of care to make sure we follow up properly and do what we've said we're going to do." That never happened. So I got overlooked and just carried on with life, unaware of this until dad died. Yeah, my connection's fine, but YouTube, like every other tech company, is slowing down everyone's bandwidth because of everyone working from home to try and make sure there's enough bandwidth for everyone. Um, yeah, exactly. My play was largely things like problem solving, fixing things, putting things together, creating patterns, things like that. We definitely don't have a remotely close family. Um, I probably see family members unless there's a purpose. I probably see family members yearly or something. Over the recent year, I've had to see family a bit more because of sort of stuff going on within the family. But other than that, I don't. We're seeing it because of stuff going on. Yeah, thank you for the horses or the horse. So let me just continue on with a bit. No, I never. Well, no, I never confronted my mum or my granddad. I had obviously kind of mentioned it to mum. Oh, look, I found this, but it's of absolutely no interest or, and it's not. I'm not going to confront someone over it. It just is what it is. Social services was different back in those days. Um, I personally think that my dad was an incredibly observant person, despite being very socially inept. He was an incredibly observant person of some things, and he was noticing things in me that no one else was noticing. And had they noticed, I like to think they would have put me first as well. It would have been addressed. So, it is what it is. Life turns out the way it does. In relation to autism and my job and life, I did the video yesterday about that. Um, so a chunk of yesterday's video was on that topic. But basically, because I'm self-employed nowadays and have been entirely 100% self-employed since 2015, it hasn't affected my life hugely. My wife is around a lot because of the situation. Um, but from my perspective, I manage to still get chunks of my work done, and I'm doing extra bits like these live streams. So around Autism Awareness Week, I'll still be doing live streams to try and be there for anyone who just wants to take their mind off everything for a bit and to chat about things and what have you. So there are bits that irritate me. Like I'm a huge person that follows rules and expects everyone to follow rules, and when that isn't done, that annoys me. Like when I'm out and about and people aren't social distancing correctly and things like that. So yeah, all of my books, I've got like 15 or 16 books, but my three autism books, you can find all the details on danjoneshypnosis.com, and they're all available as ebooks and physical books on Amazon, and many book sites have them listed on their websites. Not all book sites do, but many have them listed as well. Um, but Amazon's obviously the easiest place to go and purchase the books. But if people are okay, I'll read a bit more because I'm also curious where I was going with this. Um, Mum has always described me as being very academic, whereas my brothers would want to go out and play games and play with toys. I was more focused on wanting to read books and learn. From a very young age, we had television in our bedrooms as children. Over my early years, I shared a room with each of my brothers. When I was between 5 and 9 or 10 years old, I shared with my brother, who was 2 years younger than me. He liked to go to bed early, and I liked playing. He liked to go to bed early and liked playing team games. He always wanted to be competitive. I was totally different. I didn't really want to play with him or anyone else, and definitely didn't want to play competitive or team games. I like to do the best I can, but I don't care whether I win or lose. And with that in mind, I don't like playing with people who are very competitive and get angry if they're losing, and overexcitable and smug if they're winning. We both like different TV programs. Every year around Christmas time, the James Bond and Jaws films would be on different TV channels at the same time. My brother always wanted to watch James Bond. I always wanted to watch Jaws. Not because it's supposed to be a scary film or a gory film, although I've always liked horror films because they make me jump and can evoke some level of feeling in me. I wanted to watch Jaws because It has many nature scenes to watch and listen to, and footage of sharks and fish, which I find relaxing. James Bond, meanwhile, seemed to be all about people interacting with each other. There are very few slow scenes of nature. It also had far more loud music and sounds like gunshots. It's not that I don't like James Bond. I like clever action scenes, inventions, and ingenuity. But given the choice, I'll watch the film with the most nature. Not that any film was particularly easy to watch back in those days, when I'd be trying to watch the film on a black and white screen smaller than a mobile phone, embedded within a briefcase sized box with a fuzzy picture and having to constantly move the aerial around in the room, trying to hold it at the perfect position for the duration of the film. One thing I discovered from having a television in my room was open university TV programs. Late at night, after my brother had fallen asleep, I'd often watch the TV on quiet because I was still wide awake. Eventually, I noticed there were programs on that seemed to teach things like maths and science. It didn't matter too much what the topic was. These programs were educational. They weren't just wasting my time. I didn't always understand what I was learning, but I enjoyed watching them because I felt, for the duration of the program at least, that I was learning something and could follow what was being taught. I never felt like I didn't understand. When I was 8, I remember my mum taking me to Arundel Library. She knew how much I loved learning. Mum got me and my brother and I, library cards. When I went in, I sat down on the floor and read many of the non-fiction books in the children's section. The books in the children's section didn't really take much time to read. I was able to withdraw many books at once, so I quickly worked my way through all of the children's non-fiction books that I was interested in. One day, not that long after joining the library, I wanted to go into the adult section. I could see that there were so many more books in the adult section. The librarian told me I couldn't go in there because I was a child. I tried to explain that I wanted to read the adult books, but she refused to allow it. This frustrated me. I couldn't understand why I wasn't allowed to learn what adults were. Growing up, it was common for my brothers and me to get bought a mix of toys and books for Christmas and birthdays. My brother didn't usually want the books that he was bought. He found them boring, and I usually didn't want the toys that I was bought for the same reason. So we would swap with each other. I'd give him my toys and he'd give me his books. One year when I was 10, an uncle of mine, who was a magician, among other things, gave me an A level book on science. I remember my mum instantly taking it from me. She was aware it was a book for someone older than me. She said to me that my uncle didn't really understand children. He didn't know what you should get children of my age for presents. She told me that she would return it to him and see if he can get me something more suitable. I didn't want something more suitable. I wanted that book. So I kept the book. I remember reading and rereading it and carrying it around with me everywhere. When I was older, ideas in the books got me in trouble in school in science because I was giving answers that were different to the answers I was supposed to give. This science book was the first of many science books I've been bought and purchased myself over the years. It became common to get science books or books on general knowledge or nature or dinosaurs for my birthday and Christmases. The next section of this is called Magic, Misdirection, and Friendship. Let's see what comments we've got. Yeah, lavender on your pillow. That's nice. Just reading what people have put. Lavender again. Yeah, obviously I get a cut of profit if it's bought on Amazon. Let's read. Amazon won't be sold out of my books. Even if they say they are, they're not. what they're probably doing is restricting. So it'll depend on delivery. So if you're logged into Amazon, depending on whether they think they can get it, dispatched to you and delivered to you, would depend on, because all my books are print on demand. So that means there's no stock. Amazon has its own printers. They print the books and they ship it to you. Um, and so yeah, but depending on where you are in the current climate, um, they're obviously having to allow for the fact they could be understaffed. They might have certain centres closed, and so they have to say things like sold out, and then we'll let you know when it's back in stock or whatever if you order it. Um, and obviously, they're also all available as um, ebooks as well. So yeah, I'm sure many people out there remember where you used to have to stand halfway across your room waving around a portable aerial to try and get TV reception on a small black and white grainy TV. And one of my issues is it's better now, but one of my issues when we moved over to digital was the fact that digital is all or nothing. At least in the olden days, if you really, really, really wanted to watch a program and the signal was really bad, you could think, well, at least I can see a fuzzy version of this program, and at least I feel like I've watched it. Whereas once it turned to digital, which the signal's boosted a lot now, but once it turned to digital, there was like a couple of years where if the signal dropped at all, you just got a blue screen and you couldn't watch any of the program that you wanted to watch. There was no kind of, oh, the picture's bad, but at least you can hear the audio or something. So yeah, so the next section of my book on primary school years is called Magic, Misdirection and Friendship. Although during my primary years, I had poor emotional connection, I didn't really notice it. From my perspective, I was living in my own world. My dad had written about my poor emotional connection. My mum had mentioned my difficulties with emotional connection. But to me, I was more interested in doing things on my own. Human nature is a wonderful thing. Although I didn't approach others to try to befriend them, others would sometimes approach me. I liked familiarity and certainty, and I disliked engaging with people. I think I was lucky in some of my early aha moments. One such moment was realizing that if I had a friend or two, I felt more comfortable speaking with them than with people I didn't know. I was able to learn how they would respond, and if they walked away and stopped spending time with me, it wasn't important. But while they were there, I could use them to make my life more comfortable. Writing this down here with my adult head on, I feel like it sounds bad. It was and still is one of my ways of coping with the world. If I wanted something, all I had to do was find a way of getting the person I was friends with to be the one to sort it out. So if I wanted to have something to drink, I would try to think about how I could encourage my friend to go to the teacher and ask for me. I'd do things like encouraging them, saying that it would be good if we could both have a drink. Or I would appear to be helpful. And if we were doing something together, like making something, I'd offer to do a task I thought they would least like to do. I'd say, "Oh, I'll do that for you if you want." And while they're pleased with me doing something they didn't want to do, I'd say something like, "Oh, this is quite difficult. Would you be able to grab me a drink?" I would try to make it look like I didn't want to stop then because I was so focused on getting it done. I'd get the message across that what would really help me to get things done was having a drink. As an adult, I now know that I was playing into a theory from social psychology about how people like to reciprocate. If you do something for someone, they're more likely to do something in return. Between about 8 and 10 years old, I learned a number of these techniques to influence situations and to make them more comfortable for me. Then in later life, when I discovered hypnosis, I realized that many of these techniques are in fact hypnosis techniques. Another technique I used to use was one for influencing groups of people. When I was in the playground and would want to play manhunt, for example, and everyone else was thinking about playing football, I'd suggest the idea of manhunt loudly enough for children either side of me to hear the idea. I wouldn't make a big deal out of it. After a moment or two, if those children quite liked the idea, they'd suggest it, and gradually the idea would spread through the group until the children who actually made the decisions picked up on the idea. Then one of them would suggest it, and everyone would agree with the person who suggested the idea. No one would realize that I had suggested the idea first, and I didn't care whether I got credit for the idea or not, as long as we were doing what I wanted. I saw this happen to other children, where they would suggest ideas, seemingly get ignored, then eventually someone else would suggest the same idea and everyone would agree with that person. The child who originally suggested the idea would get stroppy about how they had come up with the idea first. It confused me as to why they got stroppy when they were doing exactly what they wanted to be doing. Did it really matter who took the credit for the idea? The idea didn't always work. Not all my ideas were things everyone wanted to do. But if I was expected to play with other children, I'd rather be doing something I see as having educational value than just, say, playing football. I liked manhunt because I got to practice evading capture. I developed skills for sneaking around and having patience. I could see that these skills could have value. I couldn't see how chasing a ball and hitting it into a net had value. You also don't have to work with others when playing manhunt. You may share a team, but you still work on your own. Whereas with football, you're expected to work together. I've never been particularly competitive, but I do like to do the best I can, and I stick to rules. I don't have a very good emotional connection with others and struggle to understand their perspectives on many emotional issues. Mum and Dad have both described how I seemed to have poor emotional connection. I've learned over the years how I'm supposed to respond in some situations. I still make mistakes, but I do much better than I did when I was young. I remember playing manhunt while at a scout camp. All the scouts were divided up into two teams, with a few leaders on each side. I had been evading capture through most of the game when one of the scout leaders noticed me and gave chase. The idea of the game was for the other team to touch you and you were out of the game. As the scout leader followed me through the woods, I jumped over and ducked under branches, evading him. Then, as I jumped over a fallen tree, the scout leader ran straight into it, breaking his leg and collapsing on the floor. He screamed in pain and asked me to help him. I went back to him and stood near him, but out of his reach, and shouted for someone to come and help him. I wasn't prepared to get close enough to be touched, because that would put me out of the game. Once I saw others coming, I ran off and disappeared into the woods. From my perspective, I did what I could to help without getting tagged. From the perspective of others, they felt I should have stayed and helped more and stopped the game at that point because someone had been injured. But if I had stopped and helped and been touched, I would have been out of the game. I would have been out had they decided to continue with the game. I recall as a child regularly being told off for answering for my brother. Mum would be driving along and would ask my brother what the road sign coming up said. Before my brother had time to answer, I'd pipe up for him. I didn't know why I did this, and I know I still do it. When it happens, it's confusing to me. If I'm on a training course, I don't do it because the trainer is the perceived expert and I'm not there to show what I know. I'm there to learn. In other situations, though, like watching a film or television program, I can't help myself. An example would be watching The Mentalist. This is one of my favorite TV shows, and I usually know who is likely to have been the murderer or how and why it happened, even before the titles roll at the beginning of the program. The same with Elementary, and often Sherlock, and magician programs like Darren Brown's shows, and his live shows too. When I know the likely answer, I feel compelled to tell people my theory. Whenever I come up with ideas, I always feel compelled to share them. Mum's always told me that I have a natural talent for music. As an adult, I can't play any musical instrument, although I love the idea of being able to play them. and to have many different instruments. I one day hope to play, and I do try to learn. But as a young child, I was better at some aspects of music. When I was about 6 or 7, my nan taught me to play Yellow Bird on the piano, which I can still play. And my granddad taught me to play a few two-handed songs like In the Mood and Sentimental Journey with left-handed Boogie Woogie Shuffle. My hands were initially too small, but I picked it up and grasped it quickly from copying what my grandparents had showed me. I had difficulties synchronizing my left and right hands while playing, but I didn't do too badly given I'd rarely played anything on a piano before and had never had any music lessons. Unfortunately, my stepdad didn't like us playing music at home, so I only ever got to play instruments when I was at my grandparents' house. Even then, I had my brothers around, so didn't really have much chance to properly learn instruments. I remember sitting at Nan and Granddad's piano for hours at a time trying to play tunes, following the Learn Piano books. I could get through all the books and play everything slowly, but I could never seem to progress to playing faster and more fluidly. During my primary years, I remember finding it difficult to relate to others. No one around me seemed like me. I felt I was different to everyone else in my life. To some extent, I felt my granddad was similar. He always seemed calm and everything about him seemed logical. He was interested in playing music and cycling and worked as an accountant. He didn't display lots of affection by hugging and gave minimal interaction with others from what I could see as a child. Also, one of my uncles played the trombone and loved trains, even working on the railway, but he also seemed to like more social interactions. He seemed to want to be in the company of others, even though he also appeared nervous or shy around other people. The family member who most interested me was one of my uncles. Among other things, he was a magician. He also designed things like irrigation for golf courses and had an interest in photography. I remember always being fascinated by his magic tricks. He also set puzzles for me in birthday and Christmas cards, to which I'd reply with puzzles back to him. I've always loved magic. Unlike some people who don't want to know how things are done, my mindset is that I want to know. Knowing doesn't detract from the experience of the trick for me. It's the process of the trick and how it was done that I like more than the end result. Even for tricks with simple methods. I often hear people say that the solution to some tricks is so simple that knowing it would ruin the trick. But when I see a card disappear and I have somehow not noticed how it was done, I want to know how it worked. I know the magician must have palmed the card, but I didn't see it. So I want to know how the technique I want to know the technique they used. If the card is to appear elsewhere or to change into another card, or there is some other element to the trick, I want to know this too. When I used to watch my uncle, he wouldn't tell me how his tricks were done, so I wanted magic sets and books on magic for presents. I'd fill notepads with ideas about how different tricks could be performed. One trick I designed in a notepad was an escapology trick, where a heavy weight would be lifted into position by a crane, carefully positioned on 4 poles, one in each corner above a box, which has the magician in it. Each pole is attached by a long chain to a car, so there are 4 cars facing diagonally away from the box. Once the chains are attached, the cars accelerate away from the box, with the chains being just long enough to pull tight after exactly 30 seconds. Once this happens, the poles get pulled from under the weight and it falls on the box. The trick is for the magician to escape the box before the weight falls. This obviously doesn't happen. The box falls, explosions happen around the box, and a cloud of smoke hides the box for a moment. Then, as the smoke clears, the magician is standing on top of the weight in a success pose. I used to perform magic tricks for my uncle whenever I knew he was visiting my grandparents. I wasn't very good at dexterous magic tricks, but like card tricks, but I often used to put on little shows consisting of a range of memory tricks, some card tricks, and disappearing item tricks. My favourites were escapology tricks. I used to like figuring out how to escape from different situations. One of my brothers had the misfortune of being my assistant in the box during my stabbing canes through the box trick. I'd ask him to climb into the box, seal the lid, and then stab canes through the box as quickly and accurately as I could. Usually, I managed to miss my brother. My uncle kept all of his magic items in two locked suitcases. I remember obsessing about wanting to look in the suitcases and trying to look in them on a number of occasions. It wasn't until many years later, when he passed away, that I finally had my chance. When he died, I said to my grandparents if I was allowed, I'd like two things of my uncle's. One was all of his magic things, the other was an old stuffed owl, as you know. Um, Luckily, I managed to get both, and I finally had the chance to look through his magic suitcases. Because I didn't feel I had any role models, I could. I'll read that in a minute, possibly. So let's scroll up. You're probably all bored of me talking now. Um, just having a look. Yeah, good reason to have children. Someone to stand holding a TV aerial. Um, yeah, we used to have the aerials that you plug in at the back, the ones you stand on top of the TV. I do like uh, anime and manga, and I like cartoons in general. Really, I think things are made much better once it's turned into cartoon form. Or animation form. Uh, I watch predominantly things like, I don't know, sci-fi things, superhero things, some horror TV series when they come on. Um, don't know, all sorts of different bits and pieces. I quite like uh, some action things now and then. Uh, Action fighting has improved a lot over the years. It used to be just Jackie Chan who you'd have to watch if you wanted to see action fighting that was good. Now, lots of people do good fight scenes in lots of films and TV programs. That was laughing at the Introvert Friends. Yeah, for me, it's different. It's so I find strangers easier to talk to than friends in most settings, but having some friends who know predictably enough about, so that I know how they're going to respond. For example, I've got friends who will organise hypnotherapy training courses on my behalf, and I wouldn't be able to expect a stranger to do that, and I wouldn't be able to trust a stranger to do that. So having friends who I know, oh yes, they like doing this, they don't like doing that, they can help with this, they can't help with that. Um, I kind of like So I find that helpful with friends rather than strangers. But then there are other things. For example, um, I would probably never ever sing in front of friends. I would probably never ever do storytelling, for example, in front of friends, as in like my sleep meditations. It'd be very, very rare for me to do something like that. I'd probably never ever play music in front of friends, but I can do all of that in front of strangers because I couldn't care less about the opinions of strangers. Whereas I kind of think if I'm saying that someone is a friend, I care a bit about your opinion. So yeah, so there are some things that I definitely find easier just in front of strangers than friends, and some things that are easier with friends and strangers. Yeah, I like Studio Ghibli as well, obviously. Um, Yeah, when I get onto possibly, I don't think I've planned on reading anything from my entry into adulthood over this week. But in here, I do talk about my early adulthood. I've always done certain behaviors that are to avoid social interactions. So it could be reading. As a young adult, drinking became a way of avoid. As long as I had a drink in my hand, or even better, a drink in my mouth, you don't have to talk to anyone. So people start talking to you, but you've got a drink in your mouth. They think, oh, he's busy, and they move on. So always having a drink in my mouth was a way of avoiding social interaction when I was out at in pubs and clubs and things like that. But that did mean I used to drink vast quantities of alcohol because I was always trying to make sure there was a drink that I had, so that I never had to be engaged with about anything. Um, and yeah, I always have headphones on, even if there's nothing playing in them. Um, and I give very blunt answers that hopefully make people realize it's better for them just to go away if they start trying to engage me about things I'm reading. But then the flip side is, if I hear someone talk, for example, that I've been in cafes where people have suddenly started talking about hypnosis across the other side of the cafe, and I've heard the word hypnosis, and I've instantly walked straight over to them, sat myself down, and engaged in their conversation because it's about hypnosis. I'm going to be there talking about it with you now. Um, and never thought about the fact they might not actually want this stranger walking across the cafe and sitting with them and talking about hypnosis. But it has ended up getting those people to come to my courses, which is kind of them. Glad you're not bored. Just helping you not to need to buy my book, um, or not to need to read a chunk of it. Well, inevitably, when you're stabbing your brother, there are times that you're not so accurate at going from hole to hole. Um, you hit the person who's in the middle. Um, but that was a very minimal number of times. It was very trusting of him to allow me to do it. Yeah, my brother had helped me a number of times. We never did he never asked me to do the magic tricks the other way round. You'd think that maybe that's what he would do. He would say, "It's my turn to do this trick now. Why don't you get in the box?" Um, you had a very good librarian, not like my one who wouldn't let me read the books. Yeah, I do that sometimes, flicking through the corner of book pages. I don't really have a favourite TV show. Um, I still like things like Quantum Leap. There was a hand gesture. I do have times when I can't make sentences. I do, obviously, here I'm largely reading, and even then I trip over at times. Um, I do lose track of words. I talked about this in a live stream, maybe a few videos back, um, about losing track of words for what objects are called. I think the example I gave uh, was not being able to know what a worm is called, and so I might sort of say, "Mind the wiggly sticks on the ground," because I don't know what the worm. I don't know the word worm in that moment. I get the same when I'm doing my live stream sleep meditations. I suddenly lose track of words and then have to figure out how to compensate in real time. And I have had some people on some of my videos who've noticed it, who in the comments have then commented about how thick I am for not being able to get the word right and stuff. And I just look at it as, I'm actually quite impressed I got every other word right. So I kind of just gloss over it and think, if that's what that person thinks is the greatest thing to focus on, that's their choice. Yep. But yeah, so I do have anomia, which strikes frequently. Um, and I think part of what helps me, for example, as some of you who've been conscious for longer than 5 minutes of my sleep meditations will know that it probably helps, because it means that I kind of have my brain forcing me into having to give descriptions for everything rather than just giving a label to everything, if that makes sense. Because the label is harder to find than just describing the size and shape and color and texture and what have you. So I'll do that instead. And I think that actually helps when I'm doing this. So, but then there are other times. I remember going to a party years ago, very many years ago, probably like the late 90s. And at this party, someone said to the person I was going out with at the time, said, "I thought you said that Dan was like really interesting and could talk for England and all this, and he hasn't said a single word. He's as boring as," and she was really kind of laying into me about it, and or into the person I was with at the time about it, and they were saying, "No, he is, but you have to get him on the wrong, on those subjects. If you get him on those subjects, he'll never shut up. But if you don't get him on those subjects, he'll never start talking." The same. One of my brothers met somebody and was talking about hypnosis. I don't know how, but somehow the topic of hypnosis came up with this person that he'd met, and I don't know what context he met her at, but he met this person, and she said, "Oh, have you heard of that YouTube guy called Dan Jones?" And my brother said, "Yes, that's my brother." And she then got all sort of, "Oh my God, you know Dan Jones. Oh my God, I'd love to meet him. I'd love to meet him," and all this weird stuff. And so he then contacted me and said, "Would you come and meet this friend? I've literally just met this woman and she wants to see you. She wants to meet you in person. Would you do it?" And so I obviously said, "Okay, then I'll come over and I'll meet her." And so I went over and I went to her house with my brother, and I sat in her lounge and we sat in silence for a couple of hours, with my brother saying, "Are you two not going to talk? I've introduced you. I thought that you talk better than this in this situation." And because she'd never asked me about any questions, because I assume she was still kind of fanboying, she'd never asked me any questions, and I never had anything to say because I never had any questions to respond to. So without the questions to respond to, I'm normally absolutely silent. So so there are times when literally I don't say a single word, and it's really hard to get a word out of me, or you're asking me questions that have no interest to me, and so I'm not paying any attention, and I don't respond. I don't have an answer for you. So I do have kind of two settings: either off, don't say anything to anyone; on, don't shut up, can't be shut up, wish I'd shut up, people wish I'd shut up. And so there's the two settings that I kind of have. And then I have the anomia issue of not being able to remember labels of things. Thank you for those who've liked the video. So obviously I've just read about my uncle. You know about my uncle anyway. because I've waved my magic wand on camera for you and stuff, and you've seen the owl in the previous videos over my shoulder. So I'm going to see if my coffee is still there. An iced coffee. It's cold now. Do I like chocolate? I eat a lot of chocolate. I'm not really a fan of anything in terms of food, particularly. People think I like chocolate. When I say I don't like chocolate, um, people say, well, of course you like chocolate. You literally eat kilograms of the stuff. But it's not that I like it, it's because I just shove food in my face. And chocolate is easy food to do that with. Yeah, I often get told I think like a computer. So I eat a lot of chocolate. Going back to my Butlins days, I used to work at Butlins holiday camp, and I used to live in Littlehampton, which is about 8 or 9 miles from Bognor Regis, where Butlins is. I used to cycle to Butlins and then cycle home after work. And I ate chocolate. I used to buy one of the Woolworths, which doesn't exist anymore, a shop. They used to sell what they called the world's largest chocolate bar, and it's a Cadbury's Dairy Milk chocolate bar that was, I think, 1.5 or 1.8 kilograms large, and it slotted nicely in my backpack because it wasn't like apples, which are all sticky outy. It wasn't like a lunchbox, which again it sticks out. It was flat, and so it could stick against my back while I cycled. So I used to cycle. So I used to eat chocolate for that reason, because it was easy to store. I didn't eat it because I thought, oh, I like chocolate, I'm going to have to eat chocolate. I ate it purely because it was the logical thing to eat. I still, obviously, when I arrived at work, I would eat breakfast, I would eat lunch at work, I would eat dinner at work, I would eat when I get home, and I would eat the chocolate throughout the day. So it was an additional thing. But yeah, I used to do that. Well, it feels colder than I'm aware that the coffee wouldn't be colder than room temperature in theory, or shouldn't be, but it definitely feels colder than room temperature. Definitely colder than my body temperature. Um, well, my view on someone not wanting to talk is I don't see it as a problem. If it's them not wanting to talk because they just choose not to talk, I'd be very annoyed if someone was trying to make me talk. In fact, I would not talk if someone was trying to make me talk, purely because they're trying to talk. I mentioned before in it's in here as well, but I mentioned before in one of the live streams about the work colleague who came up and said, whenever I'm over in this office, you never seem to talk to me. So I don't really know much about you, etc., etc. And I said, well, that's because you're boring. You never talk about anything of any interest. So why would I talk to you? And she obviously seemed to get upset by that, rather than taking it as she's just asked me for my reasons. And that is genuinely 100% my genuine reason. And then we carried on not talking for the rest of my employment in that place. But I would rather not talk to somebody because I don't have anything I'm very happy with silence. I'm very happy with my own company, very happy in my own mind. Um, I'm very happy knowing that if I have something I need to say or want to say, then I can go and say it. But if someone tries to make me talk, then I instantly shut down even more, because the last thing I want, and this goes for like in therapy sessions and things as well, the last thing you want is a therapist who's trying to make you talk, because that's the quickest way to make sure the person doesn't talk. Whenever I've worked with autistic children who are nonverbal, I'm happy to be non-verbal with them and just engage with them and make them smile and just sort of do whatever is right for that child based on their way of interacting with the world and responding to the world. Um, and then what you find is that over time, they just end up feeling more comfortable with you and assuming that they're nonverbal, perhaps selective mutism, rather than a learning difficulty thing that means that they haven't learned yet speech, etc., um, to a level that can allow them to engage. Then they end up engaging with you because it becomes on their terms. They know that you're respecting their model of the world and you're engaging with them through their model of the world, that they then engage with you from within their model of the world and you react to them engaging with you in their model of the world rather than trying to impose your version of how things should be or how fast things should go. I remember, I can't remember which therapist said it now, but the therapist said that the quickest way to do brief therapy is to go slowly. Because there's that kind of tendency that when people talk about brief therapy, that they think it means you've got to say, right, so between now and next time, you're going to do X, Y, and Z. And the person's thinking, whoa, 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 I haven't even thought about X, let alone Y and Z. Um, so you kind of have that, don't go, if you go slow, you're going to get results much quicker because you're going to be able to, it's kind of like, I don't know, if you were painting or something and if you try to rush, you're going to make mistakes and then you're going to end up taking longer because you keep having to correct the mistakes. But if you go at a nice pace that's right for you, then you're going to make fewer mistakes. And so actually you end up finishing faster. The same with like organizing things or something. You go at a nice pace that's good for you, you don't make so many mistakes and you get the job done quicker than if you're rushing to try and get the job done quickly and you make lots of mistakes and have to keep correcting those mistakes. Um, and then you end up taking longer because you're spending more time correcting mistakes than you are doing the right thing. The bike ride to work was 30 minutes. Well, it was less than that actually. I used to be able to beat the bus. So the bus from Littlehampton to Bognor and Bognor to Littlehampton took, I think, 35 minutes, and I used to be able to do it in 25 minutes. Once I'd sort of got a bit fitter, so I was able to cycle that in 25 minutes. And how I used to, what my, this might sound really stupid, but in those days I had to listen to a cassette player, a cassette Walkman, and so I'm not necessarily advocating that people should cycle along with headphones in. It's definitely not sensible, but it's what I did when I was an older teenager doing this. Kind of like 16, 17, 18, 16, 17. I'd moved to Bognor by the time I was 18. So when I was 16, 17-ish, I'd cycle to work listening to Meatloaf's Bat Out of Hell 2 album. And my goal was always to make it onto my bike, turn the cassette player on. And because the cassette player involved stopping, taking the cassette out and turning it over and putting it back in again, I would have to make sure I arrived at work before the music finished so that I would be sort of going on to my shift as the music finished. So that was kind of my criteria, was that whether I like it or not, I physically have to have stopped cycling by the time the cassette tape finishes, or before the cassette tape finishes, so that I can just listen to the end of the cassette tape, the end of Meatloaf for one side of the album, and then going to work. And then on the way home, I would listen to the other side of the album and do the same going home. Um, so that's kind of how I measured out that time. I've not heard of that YouTuber. Oh, water gets 2 degrees below room temperature. That's interesting. Learn something new every day. I like learning something new. Um, yeah, I would also say that if someone tried to get me on any subject other than what I'm interested in, I would have no interest in. I would probably say I can't think of anything to say. This was a big problem really when I was doing a job where I was having regular clinical supervisions, and I'd be expected to say, "How do you feel about this family?" and "How do you feel about that to do with that?" And for me, it'd be, I don't know. They are what they are. They're a case. I go in, I do my job, and then I go home. I don't have feelings about this. Why would I have feelings about it? I'm doing a job. Um, and yet the psychologist would be saying, you need to have feelings. You need to know why, what you feel about this, or what's irritating you about this. Well, nothing's irritating me. I go and do the best I can, and then I go home. Um, and it'd be very difficult because they'd be trying to instigate some kind of conversation, and then I'd have times where, because I haven't said anything, I'd be singled out as, there's something obviously wrong with me for not saying things, which would just make me say even less. But I think it's one of the hard things is being able to um, accept someone kind of as who they are. Oh, is it not true about 2 degrees thing? I'm just trying to read down. Um, if he talks a lot while multi game playing, that sounds like a brilliant sort of way of engaging him then, and talking about that and focusing on that and engaging around his interests and working from there, because that's obviously where he's at and where he's comfortable talking. um, so for example, if someone loves talking about hypnosis like me, then the way to engage me, say as a younger person, or even as an adult, is to make sure that you're engaging with me about things like hypnosis, or some interest of mine. If you're not, then I'm probably going to just walk away and not engage back, or at least I'm not going to respond, so that hopefully your side of a conversation dies down and you finish saying all that you've got to say. Obviously, this is normally my strategy, is not a particularly thought out strategy. It just is how I end up being. Is they're talking about something I've got no interest in, let them finish what they've got to say. Don't add content to it. So don't ask anything that might imply I want to know more. They'll eventually say everything they need to say, and then they'll stop talking, and then I can get on with what I'm doing. That's kind of my way of thinking about these things. So when people do that to me and talk about things I've got no interest in, um, it's just they're not going to engage. I'm happy to hear someone say something, but I don't really engage unless I'm doing it for a purpose. So if it's like, for example, if I'm doing it in therapy or in work, in terms of like when I've worked in children's homes, I will listen to a teenager talk about football, which I've got no interest in at all, because my role in that job is to be the parent. And as the parent, so to speak, in that job, my role is to show an interest in that teen's interests, and to ask questions, and to show curiosity about their interest, and to um, be involved in what it is that they're interested in, so that it helps them to open up and to feel like I'm valuing them for who they are as a human being. And so I'll do all that in that context. But if a friend came to me to talk about football, I would just tell them I've got no interest. Don't even bother trying to talk to me about that, because I wouldn't care about the football. It's of no, yeah, that just wouldn't happen. Yeah, the distance I'd mentioned, uh, about 8 to 9 miles. Looks like everyone's going to be getting a physics lesson or a chemistry lesson or a mix of both. Yeah, I end up with lots of words wrong that I end up having to go back and correct. Yeah, definitely helpful not to talk at times. Yeah, sorry, I'm being quiet because I'm reading about obviously the therapy experiences. I was just curious as well about the. So yeah, where am I at? Do I continue reading something? I'm just trying to see where I'm at in relation to. Actually, I've not got that much more of this chapter, so I might keep reading a bit because I'm about to read about role models. Yeah, Bill Nye. Um, yeah, so I was about to read about role models. So because I didn't feel I had any role models that I could relate to as a child, I started looking elsewhere. I looked to my granddad as the type of adult I'd like to be when I grew up. I didn't know at the time that I was going to end up looking like him. Um, and I shared certain interests with my uncle, as he seemed to like puzzles and solving problems and was a magician. My main role model during my primary years was Christopher Reeve as Superman. This has remained even now as an adult. I remember reading an article about how many children like Superman when they're children because of his superpowers and colourful costume. Apparently, most people grow out of seeing Superman as their favourite superhero as they grow up because he's two dimensional, and people gravitate towards superheroes like Batman with emotional depth and complexity. This definitely wasn't my experience. As an adult, I like Batman and many other superheroes as characters, but I don't relate to them. They're just characters, and many of them have traits I can't relate to, or traits that would annoy me if I ever knew them. Many superheroes seem to be quite arrogant or too emotional. They seem to make their own lives very complicated by overthinking the wrong things. On the other hand, with Superman, I was able to relate to the character. Clark Kent was generally calm and humble. He knew he had special powers. He knew he could protect himself against attackers, like when he was young and in school and experiencing bullying, yet he learned to restrain himself. He didn't feel that he had anything to prove to them. As he grew up, his superpowers started to develop, and his senses became heightened. He had to learn how to keep calm, how to manage the incoming stimuli, and not let them overwhelm him. He had to learn to be able to focus his attention on one thing and ignore the rest. This I could relate to. My hearing was overwhelmed by busy noises. My vision was overwhelmed by constant movement and complexity. There was so much to try to focus on and keep track of, and everything was uncomfortably bright. My body was full of constant sensations of irritation from my clothes and my hair on my head, and trying to sit comfortably. I remember watching Superman when I was about 7 or 8. I'd probably seen it before, but I had to reach a certain mental maturity to understand Superman and to make parallels with myself. I saw how Superman had to learn to focus on one thing and exclude everything else. I could understand that he had to learn to control his focus of attention if he was to prevent feeling overwhelmed. This is what I realized I also had to do. One aspect of me that I saw in Superman was how he would anonymously save people, wouldn't take credit for it, and would carry on as Clark Kent, acting calm, passive, and bumbling. He didn't try to take credit for what he had done. He was comfortable with people speculating and focusing on the Superman persona, while their focus wasn't on him as Clark Kent. I started developing this idea more from then on, through to who I am now as an adult. I wanted to be like Superman, calm and focused and in control of myself as a being, someone who anonymously helps others and tries to keep all focus and attention off me as the agent of change. Someone who knows what I can and can't do, but doesn't feel a need to prove that to anyone. Many children love creating dens at home. I was no exception to this. I used to put sheets over my grandparents' dining room table or arrange the dining room chairs with the seats facing outwards and lay sheets over the chairs. I don't know why other children make dens like this, but I know why I did. For me, it was somewhere calm and enclosed where I could sit in a dark and safe environment. I rarely managed to make a den that was totally dark, but I could make it comfortably dark, like the light at dusk as the sun is setting. The light levels would usually be reasonably even, which I also found comforting. I always liked dark and quiet areas. I'd crawl under the bed, which was quite a squeeze, but being stuck tightly under the bed in the dark would feel comfortable. I'd also sit in rooms in the dark. I remember getting my first digital watch. I was probably about 6 or 7 years old. The watch had a light on it behind the screen. The light didn't work very well for what it was designed. When it was turned on in the dark, it overlit one side of the watch, so you couldn't read that part of the time. Lit the middle of the watch about right to be able to read what the middle said, but it wasn't bright enough to light the far side of the watch. Obviously, people are good at recognizing patterns, so you could look at the part of the screen which was adequately lit and work out what the rest of the watch was likely to say, especially given that you know roughly the time of day already. You couldn't really make out the seconds or the first or last digit of the time, but you could make out the middle two digits. If the second digit was 0 and it was nighttime, logically it must have been 10 p.m. If the second digit was 1, it must have been 11 p.m. or 1 a.m. If the second digit was 2, it could have been midnight or 2 a.m. The third digit could narrow it down as to which 10-minute period it was, because you would see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. You couldn't tell which minute it was unless you watched closely and saw time change to a different number, in which case the final digit must have just changed to a 0. The main thing I remember about my watch, and each digital watch I had following that first watch, for some reason, I decided one day to look closely at the light. I began putting my left eye right up to the watch face, and then squinting my eye to block out some of the light so that I could see some detail. It was an unusual experience. I remember thinking it looked almost like a living system. I found it incredibly comforting to look at the light in the watch. I remember it giving me a feeling. The whole time I was able to hold all of my attention on that light. I couldn't see anything else. It felt like I was floating in space just outside of a solar system, watching planets orbiting a star surrounded by gas and dust. I found the constant, audible tone of the light relaxing and calming. When we moved from the house we were living in at the time that I had my first watch, I remember it going missing, and I remember being upset about this. I kept playing it in my mind with that belief that it went missing because I'd hidden it under the carpet on the landing in the old address for safekeeping. I don't know if I had, but I remember playing that thought in my mind over and over again. I believed that from as soon as we moved. One thing which can be an issue in my experience of Asperger's is how my mind comes to certain conclusions. I often come up with a logical response to something which is, on reflection, probably not the best response to have. An example of this is when I was about 10 years old. One of my brothers and I arrived home from school. No one was home, so we let ourselves in, and then I went back outside to play with my skateboard. After spending time skateboarding down our garden path, which sloped down towards the house, and then walking my skateboard back to the top of the path and then skateboarding down again, and doing this repeatedly a number of times, I needed the toilet. I went to the front door and knocked for my brother to let me in. My brother didn't open the door, so I knocked again. I told him I wanted to come in because I needed the toilet. He appeared to think it was funny not to let me in. I'm sure many brothers would do the same and also think they're just having a laugh. But to me, it wasn't fun, and it wasn't having a laugh. I couldn't understand any logical reason for his behaviour. I had told him I needed the toilet, and he knew I needed to come inside to go to the toilet, yet he wasn't letting me in. From my perspective, I hadn't done anything horrible to him, so I couldn't work out why he would be doing something horrible to me. Stood at the front door and trying to convince my brother to open up, I started thinking of what I should do. I needed the toilet. I knew I had to go very soon. I had to find a way of getting indoors. After a few minutes, I thought of a way I can get into the house. I told my brother that if he didn't open the door, I was going to smash through the door window and open it myself. He didn't seem to believe me, so I raised my skateboard, swung it hard as I could against the window. The window cracked when I hit it. I was about to strike it again, but breaking the window was enough to encourage him to open the door and let me in. On reflection now as an adult, I'm sure I could have come up with a better solution. My focus at the time was I need to get into the house rather than I need the toilet, even though my reason for wanting to get into the house was to use the toilet. So my focus was on finding a logical solution to get into the house. Had I been finding a logical solution for going to the toilet, I would have had many, much less destructive options open to me. I lived in the countryside. I could have gone over the road into the fields and been out of sight and able to go to the loo. Or I could have walked into the back garden and found somewhere out of sight to go in the back garden. None of this occurred to me at the time. I think this is something that happens with many children with Asperger's. They find a logical way out of a situation, but they aren't perhaps focusing on solving the wrong, but they're perhaps focusing on solving the wrong part of the problem. If they're able to step outside their current thinking and gain a meta position, they may get a broader focus about what's going on. These actions by me could be seen as aggressive, but I was just using the logical solution I'd come up with to solve the problem. I hadn't lost control and become aggressive. I was being aggressive because it was the solution to gain control again. I definitely don't advocate the use of aggression to gain control. And with all of my work over the years with victims of domestic abuse, partners, parents, and children and teenagers, I think it's something which needs addressing. If someone appears to want to control everything, and if someone uses aggression in its many forms to control situations, one thing I've had to learn is that for healthy relationships, I have to not have control. There are things I don't want to control because I don't particularly care about them, like where my wife is, who she is with, or what she's up to. None of that interests me. I only think about it if she's due to be somewhere and isn't there when I expect her to be. Then, depending on the situation, I eventually show concern because I want to know that she's safe and well. But that said, I can see how easy it would be for someone with Asperger's who wants to control their environment to develop an unhealthy level of control, perhaps over people in their life rather than just their environment. And the control over their environment could easily also become unhealthy. If you're a parent of a child who seems to be displaying controlling behavior, it's important to demonstrate comfort and support and to acknowledge the child's difficulties and feelings whilst also maintaining that the boundaries and consequences are what they are. This can feel difficult at times, but it is very important. It's also important to get help and support for your child. If they can learn to relax and learn to handle uncertainty, they'll cope. They'll learn to cope much better with life and with others as they grow up. I learned to relax because I grew up in the country and had somewhere to go to relax. But I've never been very good with uncertainty, so some situations I'll still feel uncomfortable in. Then I'll focus on behaviors which relax me and hope that the uncertainty ends. Other times I'll just escape the situation to escape the uncertainty. If I'm able to, I'll try to reframe the situation in some way, to have some elements of certainty in the situation, enough for me to latch onto to get through it. It's really helpful if these skills can be taught whilst the child is young, so that they can develop them as they grow up. I've always had an issue with the toilet as a child, and This persisted into my teenage years. I'd wet and soil myself rather than ask to go to the toilet. I'd hold out as long as I could, but asking was such a difficult thing to do. What if I asked to use the toilet and the person said no? What if I needed the toilet, went to go, and someone else was in there? And they were in there for a long time. I wouldn't be able to tell them to leave the toilet. Whenever I was out anywhere, I would try to hold needing the toilet until I got home. Even then, having a mum, stepdad, and three brothers at home didn't guarantee the loo would be free to use. But at least, if it was free, I didn't need to ask. One day, mum took me and my brothers to someone's house. I can't remember whose house it was, but I remember that they had children. I spent the duration of the stay at the family's house, sat in their back garden with their kittens, just stroking the kittens and letting them climb on me. I needed the toilet, but couldn't figure out how to ask. I tried to hold in going to the toilet for as long as I could. Unfortunately, I ended up wetting myself. I remember going back to the car when it was time to leave and being told off by my mum, which drew attention to the fact I'd wet myself in front of the family, both the parents and children. I remember feeling embarrassed by this, yet helpless. I didn't feel there was anything I could have done differently. I couldn't have asked to go to the toilet because I didn't know for certain that they would say that I was allowed or that it was free to use. One of my coping strategies for a very young age was eating. I've never been a fussy or a picky eater. I'll eat pretty much anything that is placed in front of me. In school, this made me very popular with the dinner staff. I'd get given my food, sit and eat, then go up for seconds and thirds, in fact, as many courses as I was allowed in the time that I had. This may sound like I was a dream child. Many parents probably wish their children would eat whatever they're given, rather than say that they don't like this or that. But on the inside, the story was quite different. My relationship with food is an odd one. I've always told people how much I hate eating. From childhood, I've always thought that one day someone will invent a pill that can be taken in place of food. I don't get enjoyment from eating. I generally find food bland and tasteless. I'm aware that different foods have flavors, but my only way to describe them is as tasteless. I have always wanted to eat strong flavors for this reason. I also find that to feel like I get something from the food, I want a large quantity of it. I've always been a quantity over quality person. The thing is, when I'm eating, I'm usually getting angry with the process of eating. I remember as a child finding it arduous to eat food. It was always a chore. Eating is a challenge. About half the time I eat, I'll end up biting the inside of my mouth or my tongue. I've always found that closing my eyes helps me to focus on eating safely. I was aware from a very young age that people often seemed to close their eyes as they put food in their mouths. I've always wondered whether this is a protective throwback from our past, where we may have been hunting and eating prey that could still be alive, which may harm us, in the same way that sharks roll their eyes back in their heads to protect them while they strike their prey. Eating's one of those things which seems paradoxical to me. I don't like eating, yet if I am going to eat, I have to eat a lot. And while I'm eating, I'm usually getting angry with it. I'm glad when I finally finish eating. Yet I decided to eat a lot. I would be finished quicker if I ate less. I don't really get much taste from food, but I like textures of food. I remember in primary school, I liked semolina because of the texture. I could easily sit for hours placing spoonful after spoonful into my mouth, as long as it was lukewarm, not too hot or cold. Steak is another food of which I like the texture. And beef, I remember as a young child, having a roast dinner at home. Following the roast dinner, there was some meat left over. So I had a big chunk of the meat. I took it to my bedroom with me and spent hours chewing until I was ready to go to sleep. At that point, I placed the chewed meat on the windowsill so that I could continue to chew on it in the morning. I wasn't trying to eat the meat as such. I was trying to make it last as long as I could, as something to chew on. My main reason for constant eating is because while I'm eating, I don't have to join in with anything. I realized if I sat in the dinner hall in primary school and ate my food, I'd finish my firsts just before everyone else, usually, and so would get seconds. Then everyone else would finish their firsts and wouldn't want seconds, so they'd go and play, while I got to sit on my own and carry on eating. Occasionally, a teacher or dinner person would come over and comment, praising me for my eating. I'd look up and smile and carry on, but they wouldn't push me to go and play. I don't know if this would be different nowadays. Back when I was a young child, if you ate a lot of food, everyone praised you and told your parents what a healthy appetite you had, meaning your child eats well. When I used to visit my grandparents as a young child, they would say the same thing. They didn't mean I was eating healthy food, although most of what I ate was reasonably healthy, because I would eat whatever I was given. So as long as my parents, grandparents, and the school were serving healthy food, then that's what the main food was that I ate. Nowadays, I wonder whether a child eating almost non-stop would lead to the parents being told the child is overeating, or whether the healthy appetite remains. Eating got me out of a lot of interactions with others. I could have a mouthful of food, which would get me out of talking with others. I could have a plate full of food, which would get me out of having to join in things. I would do this at parties. I had to attend a family event. And family events. I remember attending a family barbecue. All the children went off to play, and all the adults were interacting with each other. I pulled up a seat at one end of the table of food and I ate all that was in front of me, but before moving the chair along and eating what was in front of me at the next table. I continued until I'd worked my way to the end of the row of tables. By then it was time to go. I think there had only been a couple of times in my life I can remember feeling full and feeling like I needed to stop eating. Normally, I would just be shoveling food into my mouth until it's all gone. Even though I hate eating, I feel I'm supposed to eat everything in front of me, so I do. Through my primary years, I started becoming aware of who I am, of what I like and dislike, and of how I was different to other children. I also started to develop strategies and ways of fitting in and coping and appearing normal. So that is the end of the primary years chapter. Um, let's see what anyone's commented. So, yeah, obviously tomorrow I'll be moving on to talking about I can't even remember now, secondary years, I think, something like that, being a teenager. Um, just reading what people have written. I like the dark too. Yeah, dark is good. It's so much more peaceful. And I sit in dark rooms, like with all the lights off and things wedged under the door to make sure no more light can get in or what have you. Um, thank you about the Superman comment. Yeah, I always try and do that. Um, I try and make sure that anything that happens, I want to be anonymous, and if I could do this without having my face on camera, obviously I would do this. As many of you know from some of my other videos, older videos where there's like characters on like animated characters and things. Um, I quite like the idea of being completely anonymous if I can, and I like the idea of everyone taking credit for their own stuff and not me taking credit. Yeah, I like the universe programs as well. Iced coffee cooling. Yeah, Abby comes in here in this room and turns lights on, saying, "You're sitting in the dark. Why are you in the dark?" And yeah, I'm happy to walk around in complete darkness. Um, and everywhere I've lived, no, nearly everywhere I've lived, I think two places have had windows, but nearly everywhere I've lived have had windowless bathrooms, and so I've always been able to go and sit in windowless bathrooms, which is quite cool. And they'd be very quiet in windowless bathrooms. It'd be like it would shut the sound down as well. and I do that obviously in this flat. I remember being with a friend in the woods, and a jogger came running along, and my friend got scared half to death. Thought it was something like Jason Voorhees, this heavy breathing, stomping sound coming towards us. Obviously, I was far more calm about the idea of being in the middle of the woods at night time. Yeah, so anyone who's friends with me who invites me to theirs, um, uh, not that this is a common thing. I can't recall the last time I was ever invited to someone's house for a meal, um, or even out for dinner somewhere. But if I ever am, um, it has to just don't expect any praise for the food because you won't get it. Um, and don't give me a ridiculously small, don't take me to a posh restaurant that serves up 6 chips and the thinnest bit of steak and calls it a meal. Um, I'll be sharing more of the book as the week goes on. I thought actually, I think it was Ellen mentioned it, but it sounded like a really good idea actually to read a chunk of the book. Keep stopping and starting, but read a chunk of the book. Um, People then get to hear what's in it, what my experiences are, um, rather than me having to try and think, oh, what could I say about that period of my life or something. They just get to hear it, and maybe it'll be helpful to people, or helpful for understanding or whatever. And then, yeah, I find eye masks feel weird. It's really annoying because I want eye masks to work. Um, I like the idea of eye masks, but they frequently feel so horrible on your face. And yeah, it's a very difficult thing to get. I don't think I've not yet. I'm sure you can find, if you keep trying lots of eye masks, eventually you can find something that you just resonate with and think, oh, actually, this one fits nicely, feels just right. Um, but yeah, it's I much prefer sitting in a totally dark room. Um, so, for example, my bathroom here has no windows. I can shut the all the doors to the corridor so that there's no light, or very very minimal, just a slight slither of light coming from like the windows that are in those rooms out into the corridor from under the door. Um, and then shut the bathroom door and then wedge towels under the bathroom door, so that no light can get under there. And then, although you can get just the slightest bit of light around the rest of the door frame, it's very minimal because there's only those tiny slithers of light coming in from predominantly the bedroom and the living room. And so it's virtually totally pitch black. And then it's just a nice cool room. The bathroom is a nice temperature. There's no heating in there on its own, so it's a nice temperature. It's cool, and I don't know, cool is probably the wrong word because it's not cold in any way. But it's just nice temperature, and I can just lie on the floor, and I don't have to have that sensation of an eye mask on my face or anything. I can just lie there. I can have my eyes open like normal, and I can't see anything. And that is nice and comforting. Um, so yes, it's quite nice. Whereas I'm sure there are some eye masks. I've tried different eye masks, but it's very hard to find. I've not found any suitable yet. And yeah, caves. I like caves as well, for the same reason. And when I went and taught in Poland, I really liked going down into the mines. Um, I was kindly invited over to Poland to teach hypnosis, and Malgosia, the person who invited me over, had arranged a trip to go down a mine, and I found that so I could have lived down there. It was a shame that there was a guide. I would have needed a guide, but yeah, it was a shame there's a guide with me. I could happily have moved in to the mine on my own. I wasn't a fan when he turned on, this is what the sound of all the machinery sounds like when the machinery's on. Then it was like, nope, don't like that. Don't like the mining aspect. But, this underground area that's dimly lit, that can be even dimmer lit by just turning it off. I liked all that. I liked the air down in the mine. I liked the stillness of the experience. Likewise, when I was buried in the sort of coffin box type thing in Dubai in the desert, which I've spoken about before. Again, I liked that. I liked, once you're buried in a box and you've got sort of 2-3 feet of sand piled in on top, no light gets in. You're just in that box, nice and cool, nice and still, nice and silent. Um, all sounds are muted, so any movement you do is just a muted kind of sound, and it's so incredibly relaxing. And the same in caves and things. And I think that's why I probably do a lot of. I love being on. I talk about this. I think in the secondary years part, I did scuba diving, and I think a lot of what I like underwater is that muted sound, kind of change in sound quality, um, and a deeper level to most of the sounds, which is quite nice. And I think in my sleep meditations and things, the reason stuff like that crops up a lot, even when it's not asked for, is because I find it something that I can easily kind of have a sense of doing because it's stuff that I will do. And yeah, I also prefer it when my eyes are actually really open. So a bit like what you're saying there about liking your eyes open. I prefer my eyes actually open rather than closed. Whereas with an eye mask, I find that because there's something right on your eyes, like materially stuff, um, I always feel like I've got to close my eyes. But then it just feels more comfortable to have my eyes open but not be able to see than it does to have something that seems to almost be holding my eyes shut as such, if that makes sense. Um, but yeah, so far I've not been fortunate enough to find something. Maybe I'll this Bucky eye mask thing. I'll look it up maybe. Um, but I've not found anything that's worked for me over all the years of trying different types of masks. One's dedicated for sleep, for example. One's with elastic. One's with Velcro. One's with thicker material. One's with thin material. All different sort of things. But yeah, I learned to scuba dive here in the UK in freezing cold water in October one year as a teenager. Um, where out to sea, I passed my PADI open water diver qualification 5 miles out to sea off of Littlehampton, which is on the south coast, in October during the October half term, and you have to kind of dive down and do the thing of floating off the bottom, keep sort of raising yourself up and lowering down again. You have to do the thing where they're going to turn off your air at some random point and you have to go to the surface breathing out the whole time, all this sort of stuff. But it was incredibly rough, enormous waves. Everyone else on the dive training threw up. I didn't, so that was good. But being that rough on the surface, when you then got underwater, it was so incredibly peaceful. And what I really liked was the fact that the only way you could see anything, everything was just a kind of murky brown, kind of greeny brown color. The only way you could see anything was if you touched your face mask. So if I put my hand on the face mask, I could see my hand. If I took my hand off the face mask, even say an inch or something, I couldn't see my hand. There was no visibility at all. And we were told, be careful because there are basking sharks that swim along. with their mouths wide open, and you could accidentally end up swimming into one if you let go of the rope, and which you're told don't let go of because there's also a lot of tide, and you could instantly let go and not be able to re-grab it, especially given that there was no visibility and so you can't see anything. um, and they told us on the course that if you learn to scuba dive in UK waters like that, then you're pretty good at being likely to be able to dive in most other places around the world, doing the same kind of stuff. So I'm not talking about like you could suddenly dive 100 meters somewhere, but doing the same kind of level of diving. You've dived in worse conditions than you're likely to face, say in the Bahamas or whatever. Um, so I quite like that. Yeah, we had to the first. There's three stages for the scuba diving course. The first one was um, uh, diving in a swimming pool, nice, warm, bog standard indoor swimming pool. That was really easy, obviously, and nice and warm to walk into. The one that I found the coldest was the second stage, which is you then dive in some lakes, and the lakes had no visibility either, and also had really deep sediment that was so soft and nice to touch. So when you're underwater on the bottom, but it had really deep sediment. And the lake, the other annoying thing, unlike diving out to sea, was that you had to walk into the water from the shore. You didn't drop off the back of a boat, so you very very slowly froze yourself. You had this freezing cold October lake water gradually rising up your ankles, then rising up your legs, rising up around your groin, rising up your stomach, um, and obviously seeping inside the suit, this cold water. And then, as soon as you move one leg, suddenly you get this rush of cold water flooding straight up the inside of the suit. And obviously that water then warms up because of your body heat. But just walking in from the side until you're underwater, until you're out of your depth, and then swimming, and then getting to a point where you're told, okay, now stop and now dive down. That was far colder to do, the walking in. Once you're in fully, it was okay. But after, because your body heat has warmed up the layer of water that's next to your skin. But the actual walking in was freezing cold. And then diving down to the bottom was fine, apart from not being able to see, but then the lake was totally still, so you didn't have that risk of floating away somewhere with some current. But the sinking into the sediment at the bottom was a bit unnerving, because you had a kind of tickly sensation, almost like resting down on what I imagine would be resting down in a cloud, almost, if you could. Just that kind of, that your legs are touching something, but you can't quite work out what. And then next minute you're kind of waist deep in sediment, and you're touching it with your hands, and it's just feeling like incredibly soft powder. So that was nice, but a bit unusual, and there was no visibility. Whereas diving out to sea, it wasn't particularly cold getting in. There was that one drop off the back, splash down, rush of water, and you're in. It wasn't as bad as walking in, and it was just the current and trying to keep track of everyone else and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I like the not being able to see and stuff. That's relaxing and peaceful. It gives you a sense of being alone, like being in a lake where you can't see anyone, and yet you're actually in a lake with, say, 6 people, or being out to sea and there's 6 people around you in close proximity, but you genuinely can't see anything at all. I never stopped breathing. I just carried on breathing as I normally do, which is generally very, very slow, long breaths. So I don't recall ever stopping breathing. And obviously I remember being taught about how you need to make sure you're breathing properly and breathing all the air in and all the air out. But yeah, so fortunately I didn't stop breathing. And it's another one of those things that I was told I seem to be a natural at, probably because the whole thing just felt so familiar, even though I'd never done it at the time I was doing it. Just the process of when they were teaching on dry land, you're going to need to breathe in this way. It's like, so I have to breathe normally. Okay, then that's fine. Um, so the only bit that I kind of struggled with was where they turn your air off and they don't tell you when they're going to do it, and then they just turn your air off during the training, and you then have to swim to the surface no faster than their hand that's above your head. You can't see their hand above your head, so you have to make sure that you're getting the sort of rate that you're rising up to the surface correct, not going too fast or slow, um, without any visual markers of what you're doing. And you've got to breathe out the whole time, and especially when you can't see anything, you can't see the surface, you can't see anything unless it touches your mask. So if some seaweed hit the mask, I could see the seaweed once it hit the mask. If I touched it with my hand, I could see it, but I couldn't see anything else. And I remember that being a bit unnerving, because I remember getting to the point where I was going really struggling. Think I've got no more breath to breathe out. The surface had better be here soon, because everything's turned off, so I can't breathe any air in because they've turned the air off to my mouth. And so I remember that being unnerving just at that moment, where I was thinking, I don't even know how close to the surface I am, but I do know that I'm literally maybe 2 seconds away from no longer being able to breathe out, and I'm going to be in the position of having to hold my breath before I can breathe in. And you're not allowed to hold your breath, or else you fail, and you can't breathe in because breathing in water is really, really bad for you. So so that was the only bit that I remember. It worked out okay. Obviously, I literally had managed to do it just right. But that was the only bit that was slightly unnerving, was that moment of, I'm not at the surface yet, but I'm about to run out of breath. Let's have a look. Yeah, it is common when people experience fear or anxiety that they do kind of have a tendency to stop breathing. Um, Part of it is it's quite a good strategy, because then, so looking back historically, then you end up passing out. And if you pass out, you essentially freeze. You pass out, go loose and limp, and collapse on the floor. Whatever the predator is that's causing you fear and anxiety. So again, this is going back historically, like 10,000 years, 20,000 years ago. That's going to help you. You pass out, predators then don't need to keep hunting you, and they're less likely to carry on attacking you because you're already down. They don't need to keep attacking you. They think they've got you. Um, and then obviously when you pass out, so this is the same with panic attacks and things, that if you have a panic attack and worry that you're going to pass out, if you do pass out, the reality is that your breathing then normalizes, your heart rate then normalizes, your body takes care of itself, and you then come round at some point. You don't kind of um, have, you don't, obviously there's times people have had heart attacks and things, but it's very, very rare that something bad is going to happen to you because of that, unless an accident happens because of it. So obviously if you're driving a car and have a panic attack, that could be dangerous. But yeah, I remember when I did my therapy training. So this was 2000. This specific course was 2003, 2004, and I remember as part of the training, you have to see real clients, obviously, and how it would be set up is that um, across those sessions there would be 4 client sessions, and so there would be in the room 3 other students plus yourself, and across that day the 4 of you will do a client session in front of the other 3 other students. And there's also an instructor who's marking you, and if you fail the client sessions, you fail the course. So no pressure. If you fail the client sessions, you fail the course. And so I remember you're not allowed to ask the client what their problem is. when they arrive. You go and meet them at the university entrance. You walk them to the room that you're going to be doing therapy with them in. They sit down opposite you. You then say, okay, so what brings you here today? What would you like help with? And they can literally say anything. They could say, I suffer from severe depression. They could say, I've got post-traumatic stress disorder. I've got an anxiety disorder. I've got obsessive compulsive disorder. I've got an addiction, whatever it happens to be. They'll say something that's wrong. And it may not be something that you've actually learned about yet on your training. But the idea is that in therapy, you will always end up at some point having a client in who you don't know what to do with their problem specifically once they present it. And so you have to know how to respond to these things. And so I remember saying to my first client that I had like this, look, that instructor and those three students, they're staring at me. The three students are trying to figure out what I do right and wrong so that they can think, oh, that's a good idea. I'll make sure I do that in my session, or I definitely won't be doing that. And I said, and the instructor is marking me. And if I fail this session, then obviously I fail the course. So if I panic and get too nervous because I'm being judged in front of you while I'm doing this therapy, and I pass out on the floor, these are all trainee therapists and an instructor who's also a therapist. They'll keep you good company. When I come round from passing out, I'll finish the session. And then the client would normally laugh, and that would make light of it. And I have acknowledged the worst case scenario, which means that I'm also acknowledging, look, if this happens, I'm perfectly comfortable with having a panic attack, passing out, and then finishing the session later. So I've acknowledged that I'm happy to have that outcome happen if it happens, and then the session would go fine. But if the worst case happened, I had already acknowledged that. So, so when you have a panic attack, obviously the chances are your body normally just normalizes again. Your breathing goes back to normal, your heart rate goes back to normal, and then you come around like normal. And so knowing that obviously means that you then, in that context, I thought, well, I don't need to worry about a panic attack really. If it happens, it happens. But there is some times that it's quite common that people stop breathing. One is when you're concentrating too hard on something. People frequently, when they're so focused on concentrating, they forget to breathe. And obviously the other is when you're kind of really nervous or something and you kind of freeze internally. But anyway, anything else anyone wants to talk about or raise? I'll probably go on for another 7 minutes just to make it rounded up. And then obviously I'm back tomorrow again. And thank you all for obviously joining me here. That's very kind of you. And I know there's obviously fewer people here, probably because it's an autism one. Something I noticed, this probably won't interest anyone, but I set up, I'm just going to take a look now and see if it's changed. But I set up, scheduled all of these earlier on today. To make sure that all the autism ones were easily kind of findable or whatever, for those who want to find them for Autism Awareness Week. And yeah, stare at me. Although I can't see that you're staring at me. So I was setting all this up, these videos up for Autism Awareness Week, thinking I'll just schedule the 5 of them, 6 of them, whatever it is. 5 of them I think left, including this one. And when I started, before I scheduled them, I had 58,420 subscribers. Literally, by the time I finished scheduling them, I was down, and still am, down to the same number of subscribers as I had yesterday. 58,391 it currently stands at. So 2 subscribers higher than I was yesterday. So I think because I had scheduled those videos and they went live on my or showing on my channel, so they had no one will have got notifications about them because none of them have reached the apart from this one, none of them have reached the time when they're live. But if someone looks, for example, on their um, list of videos by people you're subscribed to, they'll see those videos. If they look under my name, they'll see those videos. And if they and some of them probably YouTube has shared recommended videos with to try and let people know in advance that the videos are there. But I just found it very interesting that literally just during the time period of about 20 minutes or so of me scheduling each of those, just setting up a placeholder essentially and a thumbnail for each of those videos. In that 20-minute period, I lost uh, 30 subscribers. But obviously, as Abby has said, and as obviously as I agree, they're probably not people who need to be on my channel anyway. The right people are here. So yeah, so you're going to stare at me for 4 minutes 40 seconds. There are some PTSD videos I think on my channel. I don't know which ones there are. I've obviously got an entire course teaching how to treat post-traumatic stress disorder and phobias and things. I'm trying to think. I'm sure that I've shared numerous of my PTSD and phobia treatment stuff. I've got a generic PTSD one that has that you just I'm generic in my wording, so it's generic in terms of I say, see that thing. I don't use this exact word, but I say see that thing on the screen, etc. So I guide you vaguely through the process rather than if I know specifics, then I can say see whatever that's. So for example, I got ran over. So if I was working with me, I could say see that incident of being ran over on that screen, and I can use that language because I know that's what it's about. Whereas the vague one, because it's on YouTube, I can't say the specifics because I don't because everyone could be using it for a different thing. So that's the one that I would use uh, for any kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. I sometimes have trouble starting things. Normally, I even have trouble starting things. I would say during the beginning of starting it as well. I don't class it as I've actually started until I'm properly into it. But once I'm into something, so that even goes, for example, if I said, okay, I'm going to make, I don't know, 4 sleep meditations this week, the chances are it wouldn't end up happening because I wouldn't end up getting started. I'd find it so difficult to get started. And even if I started doing one, that wouldn't be enough to say I've got started because within the first 5-10 minutes, until I'm in that zone of doing it, I'm not really in that zone. And so there's loads of times, for example, even with sleep meditations, where I've got lots of recordings of partial sleep meditations. I've started them and thought, no, it's not working out for me. And I'm struggling to keep doing that, get that momentum going. And so I then, it's not going anywhere. And so I quit. And the same with computer games and things, that there's a lot of computer games where I've not been able to get started properly, not been able to get the momentum, and then I've just quit. I've got very little interest in people telling me stories. I listen to sleep meditations to fall asleep to, whether it's my own or others, because I know that I can follow along to them, and it's something to mean that I'm not kind of doing my own thing in my head. So if I'm not listening to something like a sleep meditation, frequently there's a chance that I'm going to be doing something else, like trying to change the world in my head, trying to work on some kind of invention or idea or something. So having something external to focus on, that's saying, what does this look like? What does this sound like? What does this feel like? That's trying to kind of hold my attention, um, I find helpful. And so, and obviously when I listen to things for therapy as well, so if I listen to self hypnosis things or whatever, then do I? um, I don't know how you would do it not abruptly. You just finish one sentence and then start another. Um, so yeah, and obviously if it's therapy, then I'll listen to it and follow along to it and engage with it because it's therapy. But I wouldn't listen to a story just for the sake of it. And don't need to. Abby will sometimes read to me at bedtime, um, but I normally just I'm falling asleep or whatever. Um, yeah, Abby gives a similar comment in relation to what you've just said, Holly, around the abrupt thing. um, that midway through talking about one subject, I can be suddenly talking about a subject that we were talking about, a week ago or 2 weeks ago or whatever, as if no time had passed, and as if I'm just naturally assuming that Abby will know exactly what on earth I'm talking about. So I have a tendency to do that as well, where I can suddenly abruptly change subject to something that to me is the most logical thing and it's normal, and that gets confusing. So anyway, I will go now. Thank you all for joining me over here. It's very kind of you. Hopefully, some of this has been interesting or helpful or what have you. Um, Hearing some of me just talk about what I was like as a child, sort of 5 to 10 years oldish, and hopefully that hasn't put everyone off thinking, oh my god, he's some kind of crazy person, let's avoid his channel. Hopefully it's not put anyone off like that. So if you're not normally subscribed to me, feel free to subscribe. And if you haven't already, feel free to give a thumbs up if you want. And I'll be back tomorrow. I'll be talking about being a teenager, um, and probably do a similar kind of format where I'll read a bit and then I might have a coffee. I might just have a water here, but read a bit and then engage a bit, and then read a bit more if you're happy with more, and then engage a bit more, and keep doing that kind of process until you're either bored of it and say, oh, no, no, let's just talk or whatever. But yeah, so thank you all for being here. And I will see some of you, hopefully more than some of you, tomorrow. I'll see you later. Bye.